Hey, tonight we wander through a house the kind with starched lace curtains, its polished wooden banisters, and a front door that creaks with quiet menace. You step onto a rug that's just a bit too floral, inhale the smell of wax, polish, and coal. Smoke, and you're already being watched. Not by anyone visible, not yet, but by the house itself.
Yes.
Because Victorian homes were never just buildings. They were blueprints for control. Your boots click softly on the hallway tiles. Everything feels delicate. It's like if you breathe too hard, something will shatter, and maybe that's the point. This isn't a home built to comfort, it's a stage. And the leading role? The ideal Victorian woman? Fragile, decorative, pure, unpaid mostly, but very, very busy. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and local time in the comments. Always love knowing where and when you're listening. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You close the door behind you, and already you feel it, the weight of expectation. The threshold isn't just between outside and inside, it's between the self and the performance. Victorian women were expected to leave their real selves on the doormat, along with their muddy shoes. This house is clean, too clean. It's not just dustless, but sterilized of spontaneity. You notice how the furniture is arranged, not for comfort, but for eyes. Every chair angled toward a fireplace, every cushion plumped just so. The hallway mirror is tilted not for function, but to elongate. Necks in correct posture. You check yourself in it anyway. Just a glance. That's how it starts. The hallway is narrow. It's not just practically, but symbolically. Victorian homes were full of thin, dark passageways that twisted like intestines. They were meant to separate public and private spaces, but somehow they all led to the same place. Scrutiny. Historians still argue whether this architectural style known as compartmentalization was about airflow or authority. But one thing's clear, it made every movement visible and every deviation noticeable. If you lingered in a doorway, if you walked too fast down the stairs, someone noticed. And someone probably talked. You pass by a hat stand, mahogany ornate, clearly male-coded. Top hooks are for top hats, absent now, but their ghost lingers. In many households, a woman could decorate the space, but only up to a line. The big furniture, the financial choices, the final say? His. Always his. Even in upper-class households where women held keys, literally. On a chatelaine ring, the locks they opened were rarely metaphorical. You could access the linen cabinet? Yes, the pantry. Sure. But the study? The library? Off limits? You had access, not agency. You enter the parlor. The air smells faintly of lavender and coal ash. A piano sits smugly in the corner, polished within. An inch of its ivory teeth? Women were expected to play, of course, but not too well. Just enough to suggest breeding, not ambition. That delicate line between graceful and uncouth. You sit. The chair squeaks slightly, upholstered in velvet the color of overripe plum. And you can feel it now how even rest wasn't rest in a Victorian house. It was posing, reposing. Sitting still, ankles crossed, hands in your lap like. You were waiting for a portraitist to arrive. A carriage rumbles by outside. You wonder if you could run, just fling open the door and dash for the street. But you remember, the front door didn't open for just anyone. And it rarely opened outwards. For women, Victorian homes were designed to keep the inside in and the outside out. You were expected to host, to welcome, to perform, but to leave. That was different, dangerous even. Women walking alone were instantly suspicious. In architecture as in life, exit routes were limited and surveilled. There's a bookshelf here mostly. For show, a mix of moralist novels, household guides, and sermons. You pull one down. It's The Duties of Daughters, 1861. A line catches your eye. A woman must tend to her home as a priest tends to his altar devotion without interruption. You close it a little too hard, and now you hear footsteps. Not real ones. Echoes of generations before you. girls who learned to curtsy before they learned to run, mothers who cleaned with such precision you'd think they were trying to erase themselves, widows who drifted room to room like polite ghosts, waiting for the world to forget they existed. You stand. The ceiling looms low, not because of its height, but because of its expectations. You glance upward anyway. There's a tiny crack where plaster meets beam. Even the strongest facades have fractures. A clock chimes softly. Dinner time, but not for you. This story's just beginning. Tonight, you'll discover that every rug, every teacup, every lovingly crocheted antimacassar in this house was a tool, a boundary, a whisper that said, behave, the front door is locked. The key isn't lost. It's in your pocket. You just haven't realized it yet. You step through a second door, heavier than the first, and it shuts behind you with an authority you didn't grant it. This room is dimmer, curtains pulled half closed to keep the light out or to keep you in, the dining room. But really, it's more like a stage set. The long, polished table. It's the high-backed chairs that pinch your shoulders if you sit too far back. The heavy drapes that feel more like walls than fabric. It's a room built not for feasting, but for performance. The Victorians took dinner seriously, especially for middle and upper-class families. The evening meal was a kind of theater. You weren't just feeding yourself. You were presenting yourself. And women? Women were the servers and the showpieces. You run a finger along the lace runner stretched across the table. It's immaculate. Of course, lace always is, because if it isn't, someone's blamed. It's beautiful and brittle, like the ideals it represents. A place is set at the head of the table. Wide space, ample cutlery, high vantage. The patriarch's seat. In theory, the woman of the house had one top opposite her husband, managing the flow of conversation in courses. But if he ruled the dining room like a captain on a ship, she was the steward who never got to dock. You sit down in her chair? Instinctively straighten your spine. This is a room where posture mattered, where elbows off the table weren't just etiquette, they were identity. Every bite-sized mouthful a ritual. Every silvery clink a code. You weren't meant to eat. You were meant to suggest eating. Historians still argue whether the rigid formalities of Victorian dining were a reflection of moral discipline or just a fetish for hierarchy. Either way, it was a battlefield. A woman had to navigate fish knives, conversation starters, and veiled jabs from in-laws all without breaking a sweat or her corset laces and corsets. Of course, made eating hazardous. You could faint from a single mouthful if you misjudged. Your lacing that morning, that wasn't an exaggeration. Women were taught to train their stomachs as much as their minds. Dessert wasn't just optional, it was dangerous. You glance at the sideboard, silver dishes with lids like helmets. Underneath, maybe roast beef, maybe boiled cabbage. But you know the real heat came from above the table. Mother-in-laws whispering about pregnancies, fathers judging dowries, cousins snickering at your new gown being last season's silhouette. In this house, the dining room was where women proved they were worthy of belonging or worthy of marrying off, and you could never forget it, especially when servants stood by the walls like living punctuation marks, watching, judging, silently tallying your grace or lack thereof. You run a hand under the table and feel a Regia-carved signature in the wood, barely visible. E.M., 1879. A child, maybe? Or a rebellious housemaid? A moment of resistance hidden beneath the most controlled room in the house. Even rebellion had to be hidden, carefully etched into the margins of domestic life. There's a bell pull. Near the doorway, velvet cord, small tassel. A communication device, but only in one direction. Women could summon help, yes, but not escape. It was like shouting into a cave and expecting a ladder. You imagine her now, the wife, poised at the end of the table, offering small talk, managing tempers, checking that the potatoes weren't overboiled. She's the perfect hostess. But inside, she's calculating how many more dinner parties she can endure before she vanishes into the wallpaper. One quirky fact? Some women actually did, at least metaphorically. Victorian wallpaper was so intricate, so overwhelming, that women described. feeling like they dissolved into it. Charlotte Perkins Gilman would capture it later in the yellow wallpaper. But the feeling was already well known. You decorate the room until the room erases you. You stand. Enough of this room. Enough of the silent applause for invisible performances. You cross to the doorway again. This time, you notice something. A tiny mirror, tucked into a corner, positioned just high enough to catch the eye of someone rising from their seat. Subtle, strategic, a final reminder to check. Yourself, literally, you turn away, but you're already self-conscious. That's the house working as intended. There's a hallway beyond, of course. There always is. Leading to more rooms where women were meant to exist without taking up space. Where every object was a reminder that perfection wasn't just expected, it was mandatory. You glance back once at the dining room. It's empty now, but still full. With rules, with ghosts, with every unspoken correction ever carved into. A young woman's mind over soup and silence, and you realize something chilling. This house doesn't need someone watching you. It's designed so you watch yourself. You step into the parlor, and immediately the air thickens, not from heat or dust, but expectation. This is the showcase room, the performance space, the silent trap. The furniture, you notice, is arranged not for comfort but for containment. Fainting couch at a careful diagonal, tea table at the center like a tether, and chairs flanking it like loyal sentries. Everything here is staged. There's no space for sprawling, no room for rest. The moment you sit down, you're aware of how. You're sitting ankles together, hands folded, back straight. You are the exhibit now. This room is for receiving guests, particularly other women. It's a social gauntlet where power is wielded through politeness and destroyed with a glance. Conversations in the parlor were battlegrounds of coded language. Compliments sharpened like blades. Smiles stretched across judgment. You can imagine the scene bonnet set aside. Gloves peeled off with theatrical care, tea poured precisely to avoid drips. And under every exchange, calculation.
Oh, married.
Well, who hadn't produced an heir? Who wore last season's trim? Every woman was watched. Historians still argue whether parlor culture empowered women with social agency or imprisoned them within performance. But the effect was suffocating. You had to become a master of invisible, wars fighting with fans, conquering with raised eyebrows, dying slowly in embroidered silence. You run your hand along the embroidered sampler hung above the fireplace. Cross-stitched, virtues, patience, purity, prudence. And maybe if you tilt your head, you can spot a single rebellious word stitched faintly between the rows. Nope, but maybe your eyes are playing tricks, because this was also the room of make-believe. Here, women played piano not for joy, but to prove refinement. They recited poetry not to feel, but to show they'd been properly trained. Even the books displayed on the end table, moral tales, religious devotionals, etiquette guides, were props more than pastimes. You pick one up. The Female Instructor, 1851, a real gem. Offers helpful advice like the charms of modesty are best observed in silence, and one must never laugh with teeth. You wonder how many women read these words and felt themselves shrinking inside their corsets. Corsets again, always. There, even in the parlor, where no one would say the word, everyone saw them. A good corset shaped a woman's body into the house's expectations. Neat, controlled, structured. It's a garment, yes, but more than that, it's a blueprint. One that the walls silently echoed. And those walls, covered in damask silk blend wallpaper that shimmered in gaslight, not too dark lest the room feel brooding, not too bright lest it seem indecent. It's just enough pattern to suggest liveliness, but not enough to provoke thought. You sit back and stare at it. Again, that feeling of being absorbed by the house. A quirky fact for you. Some Victorian parlors had morning corners, small shrines to recently deceased family members, hair woven into lockets, miniature portraits, candles no one lit. Imagine grieving in a room where every sigh had to be ladylike, where tears were only acceptable if they enhanced your complexion. There's a mirror in this room too, over the fireplace, wide and high. The kind that doesn't reflect your face so much as your posture. It's no accident. Parlors trained women to monitor themselves constantly, to sit just so, to smile just right, to listen but never too intently, to respond but never too quickly. And God forbid you doze off. Afternoon fatigue was common, especially with corsets compressing your lungs and layers of taffeta heating your thighs. But sleep in the parlor? That was social suicide. You might as well declare yourself unfit for marriage and offer your hand to the cat. You glance out the window. The drapes are drawn halfway, letting in just enough light to catch dust motes, but not enough to grant a view of the street. Victorian women could look out, but never be seen from outside. Privacy wasn't protection. It was enclosure. You think about how many hours were spent here waiting for callers, for letters, for permission, for anything to happen. You wonder how many women stared into that fireplace and thought, is this it? Is this my life? There's a small sewing basket under the fainting couch. You open it expecting needles, thread, maybe a doily in progress. But instead, you find something else, a slip of paper folded many times over. When you open it, the words are scrawled in hurried pencil. They only love you when you're quiet. You hold it there in your lap for a moment, then tuck it back. Inside, somehow it doesn't feel like yours to keep, because the house isn't just built to control your body, designed to mute your voice. This parlor, with its softness and shine, is the most dangerous room of all. Not because of violence, but because of silence. You rise, your ankles stiff, your breath shallow. The door to the hallway waits again. It's time when you cross the threshold. You swear the light dims behind you. As if the room has closed its eyes. You continue down the hall, and you begin to realize this house isn't haunted by spirits. It's haunted by the hundreds of women who never got to leave. You walk slowly now, fingers grazing the hallway's wainscoting lacquered wood, cold to the touch. The corridor is narrow, tighter than you expect, forcing your shoulders slightly inward. Victorian homes weren't built for wandering. They were built for processions. Quiet, obedient ones. No running, rushing. No room for detours. On your left, a door slightly ajar. And behind it, the dining room. You step inside, and the air sharpens. If the parlor was the stage, the dining room is the theater of war. Not with weapons, but with forks, glances, and calculated silences. The long table stretches before you like a ceremonial altar. Polished mahogany, perhaps 10, 12 chairs on either side. All perfectly spaced. At the head of the table, the master of the house, and opposite him his wife. You, or rather, the role you would have to play. The Victorian hostess, decorative, dutiful, deliciously mute, unless spoken to. You glance down at the table setting. Each plate sits upon a charger, flanked by forks of graduated sizes. Every knife edge faces inward. A soup spoon rests just so. To use the wrong utensil, social death. But of course, you already know that. Dinner wasn't nourishment, it was performance. A chance for men to speak at length about politics, empire, and business ventures, while women nodded, passed dishes, and laughed at jokes not meant for them. Not too loud, not too soon. Historians still argue whether women used the dinner table to influence their husbands privately, or if they were merely decor in another patriarchal pageant. But from where you're sitting, the porcelain and candles don't scream empowerment. The heavy drapes are drawn again. Gaslight chandeliers hang overhead like inverted cages, casting flickering shadows across the wallpaper green damask. You note, with gold trim. Opulence disguised as intimacy. You reach the sideboard, its surface cluttered with decanters, tureens, silver trays. Victorian dining wasn't about appetite. It was about appetite suppression, especially yours. Women were expected to eat sparingly, delicately, never slurp, never reach. And heaven help you if you visibly enjoyed your meal. That suggested passion, and passion. Yet, that was a problem. You imagine it now, corseted, starched, spine bolt upright, trying to eat roast duck without dislodging a single strand of hair, swallowing slowly, measuring every movement, praying not to hiccup, all while being watched. Because make no mistake, you were being watched. By the men, of course, but also by the servants, the in-laws, the friends, even by the women beside you, who understood the stakes and measured your every action accordingly. There's an empty chair halfway down the table, slightly pulled out, on the floor beside it a child's spoon. You crouch and pick it up. Children were sometimes allowed at dinner, but seen and not heard. Girls were expected to learn early manners, modesty, silence. One misstep, and they'd be sent away, sometimes with a scolding, often with a reminder. A lady does not draw attention to herself. A quirky detail here. Some Victorian households trained daughters by seating them beside their mothers with books on their heads during dinner. If the book slipped, posture was inadequate. You try it now in your mind. Tilt your neck back, chin in, spine straight. You'd barely breathe, let alone speak. And then there were the rituals: grace before meals, toasts, order of courses, soup, fish, entree, roast, pudding, cheese, fruit, each with a wine pairing, each with rules. The Victorian dinner was a ceremony of control, reinforcing hierarchy at every turn. The man at the head of the table carved the meat, not a servant. Him. That was tradition, symbolic power. He distributed the protein. You, meanwhile, might be handed boiled carrots and expected to express gratitude. You walk to the far wall. There's a framed print hanging there. The angel in the house, a Victorian ideal, the devoted wife, the domestic goddess, the silent strength. The image is delicate sepia-toned, the woman rendered with impossibly small hands and eyes, full of sacrifice. She's not real, of course, but she was the goal, and if you didn't fit her mold, if you had thoughts, desires, fatigue, well, Victorian homes often had side rooms near the dining area and formal parlors, or even cloakrooms where women could recover from faintness. Some were real fainting spells, caused by corsets or heat. Others, strategic retreats from impossible performances. 15 minutes alone, stolen breath. Historians still debate how much Victorian. Women internalized the ideals versus how many simply survived them with small acts of resistance. But when you sit at this dining table and imagine the weight pressing down, you suspect most learn to wear masks. It's better than their husbands ever knew. You place the child's spoon back where you found it, gently, as if the girl who dropped. It might return and need it soon. You glance again at the empty chair, the flickering light, the closed drapes. This isn't a room for sustenance. It's a room for surveillance. You turn to leave, and your reflection flashes in the glass of the sideboard. Not a full face, just a silhouette. It's all anyone ever wanted of you in this room anyway. The kitchen door swings inward with a dull creak. The air hits you like a wall warm, slightly acrid, laced with steam and the ghost of overboiled cabbage. You step into the belly of the beast, not the polished public part of the Victorian home, but its grimy mechanical underbelly. It smells of lard, scorched milk, metal pots, and coal. A far cry from the lavender sachets and potpourri bowls upstairs. The ceiling is lower here, the light more meager, the walls bare, save for a few utilitarian shelves stacked with jars and tin canisters. And in the center of the room, the iron stove squatting like a black dragon, its belly faintly glowing. This is where the real heat of the house lived, and it had nothing to do with comfort. You glance around, no polished wood, no silk, no delicate china. This is a world of heavy crockery, splintered countertops, calloused hands, and blistered knuckles. It's also, ironically, one of the few spaces in the house where women could move freely. But only the right kind of women. You watch her now, the cook, not a lady of the house, but a servant. Muscular forearms, apron soaked through, hair tied back in haste. She's wielding a rolling pin like a weapon. Her domain is fiery, exhausting, and thankless. You're invisible down here, unless something goes wrong upstairs. Victorian domestic manuals, such as Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household, Management dictated everything from how to store eggs to how many raisins go in a suet pudding. These guides weren't just about food, they were about obedience. The kitchen had to run with military precision. Mistakes reflected not on the staff, but on the lady of the house. Historians still argue whether manuals like Mrs. Beeton's empowered housewives with knowledge or simply overwhelmed them with unrealistic expectations. Either way, someone had to crack the eggs. You kneel beside a wooden crate. Potatoes, still dusted with soil. And beside it leeks, a sack of barley, some carrots going soft. Cheap, filling food. Most middle-class Victorian meals weren't the elaborate feasts you see in costume dramas. They were beige, boiled, and bland. The fantasy of elaborate roasts and game birds, mostly for show or special occasions. And again only for those upstairs, you hear it. The distant ding of a service. Bell. High-pitched, mechanical, merciless. Someone wants tea. Or toast. Or attention. The cook glances up, doesn't flinch. Just mutters something under her breath, and turns back to her griddle. There's a dumbwaiter set into the wall. It's roped slightly. Frayed, the pulley crusted with grease. You imagine the little tray ascending upward, bearing a chipped teapot or a plate of finger sandwiches. By the time it reaches the parlor, its origin is scrubbed clean. The lady may lift the silver lid with grace, but the sweat that made the scone doesn't come through the bone china. And here's the kicker. Even if you were the lady of the house, the kitchen wasn't your escape, it was your responsibility. Every cold delivery, every chipped plate, every lump in the gravy, on you. Not because you made it, but because you were supposed to control the ones who did. Control. That word again, eh? Quirky details some upper-class Victorian women installed. Bells in every room not just to summon staff, but to remind themselves they were in charge. Power, in this case, meant never lifting a finger, except to ring. But here's where things get sticky. Victorian houses were designed to hide labor. There were separate staircases for servants, narrow, steep, tucked behind doors, whole sections. Of the house existed purely so working women could stay out of sight. Their movement was choreographed like a ballet of invisibility. You could live in a house for a decade and never see who cleaned your chamber pot. You peek behind a door, narrow stairs vanish downward into the scullery. You hesitate at the threshold. Dampness rises. This is where dishes were scrubbed, laundry, boiled, and secrets whispered. It's colder here. Hungrier. You think of the countless girls, some as young as 10, who worked these kitchens. Their lives a blur of soap and steam and early arthritis. They slept in attic rooms so cold in winter that their wash basins froze overnight. They woke before dawn, lit the kitchen fire, scrubbed the floors, and served their employers who rarely knew their names. Historians still debate how many of these girls escaped into marriage or better employment, and how many simply disappeared, overworked, ill, forgotten. You run a hand along the edge of the butcher's block. The wood is pitted with decades of blade marks. Every scar a meal, a burn, a broken back. You glance up at a high window, its glass smeared with soot, just a sliver of sky beyond.
Ow.
You wonder, did the cook ever stop stirring her pot long enough? To look at it, the bell rings again. Sharper this time, less patient. You step away back into the corridor. The kitchen door closes behind you with a quiet thud. The smell lingers on your clothes, salt, coal smoke, and something unnameable. Something like effort erased. Control, you remind yourself, doesn't always look like domination. Sometimes it looks like making sure someone else always has dirty hands, so yours can stay clean. You follow the back hallway now, its linoleum floor warped from decades of scullery spills and damp shoes. It's quiet early sewing, till the house groans above you. Not the sound of footsteps. It's the structure itself shifting like an old woman. Turning in her sleep, you climb a narrow staircase, steeper than anything in the front of the house. The wood is unpolished, worn hollow in the center from generations of hurrying feet. You have to duck slightly. The ceiling here was never meant for comfort. These stairs weren't designed for guests. After all, they were for her. The maid, you. Reach the top and find a door that opens into the attic. A wave of musty cold hits you. The air tastes of dust, mothballs, and damp wool. You step into a narrow room bare, slanted ceiling, one thin window. A chipped enamel basin sits in the corner, next to a trunk with a broken latch. On the iron bed, a straw-stuffed mattress and a single gray blanket. This was where the maid slept. No lock on the door, no heat from below, just a straight shot up the stairs from the kitchen. So she could be summoned at dawn or midnight with equal efficiency. The Victorian house ran on invisible labor. But nowhere was this invisibility more literal than here, in the attic servant quarters. Out of sight, out of mind, until something needed ironing or scrubbing or fetching, you moved to the window. Top smoke, the distant clatter of hooves. From here, the city looks less like a marvel and more like a machine. One with thousands of tiny women like her caught in its gears. A mainstream historical fact. In 1861, the UK census recorded over 1 million domestic servants, most of them women. That meant 1 in every 3 women working outside the home was a servant. That's not a job market. It's an institution, and the institution demanded submission. Downstairs, the lady of the house may have looked refined in her bustle and cameo brooch, but her power over the household was enforced here. In silence and cold, the maid could be dismissed with no notice. Her wages docked for a broken teacup, coat her meals leftover crusts and cold tea, and still some called this opportunity. Historians still argue whether domestic service offered young women a stepping stone out of poverty or merely trapped them in a new kind of dependence. For many, the attic was the first place they'd slept alone in their lives. That privacy came with a price: loneliness, long hours, and near total subservience. You imagine her now, the maid, sitting on the edge of that bed, fingers raw from laundry, hair still smelling of beef drippings and soap. She takes a moment to unlace her boots, rub her ankles, and stare out the window, not for the view, but for a moment of stillness. Then the bell rings again, a quirky tidbit. Some wealthy Victorian families installed speaking tubes, literal pipes that allowed the lady of the house to issue orders directly. From her boudoir to the kitchen or attic, imagine being woken from sleep by a brass tube shouting, "More hot water." But the bell, simple, shrill, mechanical, was far more common. It buzzed from room to room like an electric leash. You glance down at the floorboards. They're thin. You can hear muffled voices below. The clink of cutlery, the scrape of a chair. She would have heard it all. Dinner parties, whispered arguments, music drifting up from the drawing room. All of it unreachable. Control in the Victorian home wasn't always enforced with cruelty. Sometimes it was embedded in architecture itself. The placement of the servants' quarters in heated, unadorned, physically above everyone else but socially far below, was a daily reminder of one's place. Out of sight, out of power, even the stairs themselves, steep, separate, often unlit, sent a message. You take this path, not that one. You arrive last, you leave first. You don't belong where light pools and carpets soften. You run your fingers along the wall-rough plaster, slightly damp. The only decoration, a curling postcard of Queen Victoria tacked near the bed, her stern face faded. As if even she disapproves of how small the room is in wealthier households. Servants wore uniforms, black dresses with starched white aprons and caps. But in more modest homes, there was just the servant dress, a plain gown made from the cheapest material, designed to blend in with coal smudges and kitchen stains. Anything nice was forbidden. Too close to pretension, you imagine her on her 1/2 day off per week, wearing her best dress, which might still have mended sleeves or a second-hand petticoat. She walks quickly, eyes down, hoping no one assumes she's a thief, or, worse, she has a secret perhaps, a letter hidden in her trunk, or a coin saved under the mattress. Maybe she dreams of marrying the butcher's son, or opening a bakery. You won't know. The house won't ask. It only needs her hands, her spine, her silence. The bell rings again, and you, standing in the still air of the attic, feel how that sound ruled her life. how it echoed not just through the floorboards, but through her bones. The Victorian house didn't just house hierarchy, it embodied it. And as you step back toward the narrow stairs, you carry the weight of that silence. With you, it's not just history, it's structure. It shaped more than walls. It shaped women. You descend from the attic now, careful with each step on the servant's stair, back into the bones of the house. The hush follows you. It lingers on the walls, soaked deep into the wallpaper like a perfume that never quite fades. And then there, it is the drawing room. This, you realize, is the stage. You step through a doorway adorned with carved wooden trim into a room bathed in filtered afternoon light. Heavy velvet drapes are drawn halfway, letting just enough sun touch the Persian rug that sprawls like a forest floor underfoot. Gilded frames hang above a marble mantelpiece, each holding a stern ancestor with accusing eyes. Here is where the lady of the house performed her most delicate role, ornament. But don't be fooled by the potted ferns and idle embroidery hoops. This room wasn't for lounging, it was for being seen. You spot the faint indentations on the velvet settee one. At each end, just far enough apart to suggest conversation without intimacy. The air still holds the ghost of lavender, water, and camphor. Maybe someone practiced scales on the piano. Maybe someone embroidered the same hem for 3 hours. Just to avoid silence, the Victorian drawing room was the emotional core of a woman's social identity. It was where she entertained guests, displayed her accomplishments, and most importantly, maintained her reputation. A mainstream historical fact? The drawing room got its name from Withdrawing Room A, space where ladies retreated after dinner while the men smoked cigars and talked politics. Men had the library and billiard room, and women had the drawing room, floral, stiff, judgmental. It was both sanctuary and stage, and it was always under surveillance. Not necessarily by men either. Women policed each other, dropped stitch, a clumsy curtsy, a fainting spell a few seconds too late. All of it was evidence. All of it counted. You could ruin your prospects. With the wrong shawl pin, you move across the room, careful not to bump the porcelain dog on the end table. You picture her here, the lady of the house, not yet 30, a little pale, a little too thin. She fidgets with her gloves while waiting for the vicar's wife to arrive, rehearsing lines from Jane Eyre in her head in case literature comes up. She sits just so, ankle tucked behind ankle, spine erect but not rigid. Her corset keeps her from slouching. Her smile does the rest. Control in this room wasn't physical, it was aesthetic. Everything in this space had rules. What you wore, how you moved, even how you laughed. It had to be effortless, but perfectly calculated. That's the joke, right? Victorian women were idle, as if performing 12 hours of social decorum while being singed like a ham isn't work. A quirky tidbit in 1860s. Etiquette manuals. There were entire chapters on how to sit, how to enter a room, and even how to pour tea in exactly 3.5 seconds per cup. One guide advised women to avoid smiling too freely, lest one appear frivolous or foreign. Foreign. Imagine smiling the wrong way and suddenly being accused of French behavior. You spot a photo album on the side table. Thick leather, gold-edged pages. You open it. The faces inside are somber. Children in lace collars. Men with waxed mustaches. Women with haunted eyes. No one smiles. That was normal back then. Long exposure times made smiling difficult, but also, life wasn't exactly cheerful. A scholarly debate that lingers. Historians still argue whether these drawing rooms empowered middle and upper-class women with social influence or merely trapped them in a gilded display case. Some women wielded real power from these velvet chairs. Others suffocated beneath the weight of unspoken rules. You put the album down, and the dust clings to your fingers. Now look at the furniture. Nothing casual here. The chairs are upright, narrow, upholstered in brocade that feels like it would complain if you sat wrong. The piano in the corner gleams with disuse. There's a china cabinet filled with plates no one eats from. This is a room of appearances. But appearances were survival. The door creaks open in your mind. A suitor enters. A cousin. A neighbor. seated with just enough poise. The conversation is light, safe, nothing too opinionated, nothing too plain. The lady of the house is curated. She may be aching inside. She may be bored to madness. But she'll offer you tea and ask about your uncle's gout with the practiced warmth of someone trained since childhood to make others feel comfortable while never fully relaxing herself. You stand still, imagining what it took to keep this performance going, the hair curled just so. The letters written in perfect script, the way a woman had to shift her entire existence to become what was expected in this room, and yet, here's the twist. The drawing room wasn't hers. Not really. It was a shared space. A performance space. A room where her identity was on loan, her agency filtered through etiquette and approval. No locks on the doors, no true privacy, no mess allowed. You lean down, running your hand along the edge of the hearth. You imagine the heat of a coal fire in winter, the soft hum of conversation, the rattling nerves beneath the surface of every polite exchange. Then you hear it again. The bell. From upstairs, the maid. Another pot of tea. More. Biscuits. Control in the Victorian home wasn't loud. It was ambient. It whispered from every doily, every eyelet curtain, every gentle TSK from an aunt when a young lady crossed her legs too openly. You back away, gently, careful not to disturb the balance of the room. The lady of the house smiles at you, faint, distant, exhausted. She's still there, part of the house, part of the show. You leave the drawing room, slipping through the corridor like a ghost. The door shuts softly behind you, but the eyes, those framed, matronly eyes, still seem to follow. You're not escaping scrutiny, just changing scenes now. Your feet find the threshold of a narrow, shadowed space. The nursery. At first glance, it seems peaceful. Rows of lead soldiers frozen in mid-battle. Cloth dolls sitting primly on a miniature rocking chair. A half-finished jigsaw puzzle yellowing with age. But look closer. This isn't a child's room. It's a training ground for mothers. The rocking horse waits beside a fire guard. A crib sits in the corner, too ornate for comfort, edged and laced that likely never knew a moment's rest. Breast sunlight spills across an embroidered sampler nailed above the door. It reads, "Obedience is happiness." Charming. You walk slowly now, taking in the space. It's silent, but your imagination fills in the air. Soft sobs muffled under a quilt. The lullaby hummed through clenched teeth. The sharp crack of a nanny's command as the toddler misbehaves once again. Because let's be clear, Victorian. Motherhood wasn't soft. It was an institution, and the nursery was its disciplinary wing. Here's a mainstream fact to settle into your lap. Queen Victoria had 9 children. While she was famously devoted to her husband Albert, she openly detested the experience of motherhood. An awful trial, she called it. She left most child-rearing duties to nannies and governesses, preferring political letters to playtime. But here's where it gets interesting. Victorian women were expected to embody the angel in the house, a term popularized by poet Coventry Patmore. She was nurturing, docile, pure. But in reality, the mother had limited control over how her children were raised, especially in wealthier households. The nursery was often staffed, supervised, and structured by others, yet the success or failure of the child was pinned on her. Imagine that. It's held accountable, but denied access. Welcome to Victorian control tactic number 47, responsibility without autonomy. You crouch near a faded scrapbook. The paper crumbles at the edge as you turn a page. Lock of baby hair, smudged sketch of a fox, a dried daisy, a quirky tidbit for you. Some upper-class mothers were advised not to breastfeed because it was too animalistic and might damage their femininity. Wet nurses were employed, and some etiquette books suggested that even holding one's child too often was inappropriate. Appearances, darling. Always appearances. Meanwhile, working-class mothers had no such luxury. They nursed, soothed, worked, and buried their children in staggering numbers. Infant mortality in 19th century London hovered around 15%. But they weren't idolized as angels, just laborers. The double standard pressed down like a cradle lid. You hear the creak of the floorboards behind you and imagine a governess standing in the doorway. Severe bun, woolen skirt, a sharp eye that misses nothing. She doesn't smile. She rarely does. Because it's not her child either. She too is being watched. And here comes the scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the nursery empowered Victorian women by giving them a unique influence over the moral future of the empire, or whether it confined them to the margins of power under the illusion of maternal sanctity. You walk to the window. From here, the view stretches across the hedges to the rose garden. You can almost see a little girl in white stockings, playing with a hoop and stick, her nanny watching from a distance. It's a controlled joy, like tea served on a schedule. The child will be disciplined if she laughs too loudly. And what of daughters? They were trained early for their future roles. Doll houses with tiny tea sets, toy mops, etiquette drills. Childhood wasn't about wonder, it was preparation. The nursery was just the first room in a long corridor of constraint. Still, there were moments, weren't there? Fleeting seconds of rebellion. The child who smuggled in a frog, a mother who stayed too long at bedtime, humming forbidden lullabies, the governess who scribbled poetry between lessons. Little ruptures in the velvet rules. You glance at the fireplace, its iron grate shut tight. A faint chalk drawing is still visible on the hearthstone, a child's attempt at a bird, maybe. A crooked heart. Someone got scolded for that. You can almost feel the tension in the air of the woman kneeling on the rug, brushing a girl's hair before bedtime. 100 strokes. No more, no less. Silence. Always silence. In the dim light, the room's soft toys look like witnesses. They've seen too much. Bears with missing buttons. A monkey with a twisted grin. A lamb with threadbare ears. Of them smile, and when bedtime came, no comfort in chaos. Victorian bedtime stories were often moralistic. Think cautionary tales where naughty children were burned, eaten, or turned into ink. Sweet dreams. You step backward, out of the room, a little unsteady. The air is lighter in the hall, but the nursery leaves a film on your skin. It's a kind you can't quite wash off, because you understand now. Victorian women were trained to mother. In a house that limited their motherhood, they were sculpted into symbols of purity, restraint, and duty, but those same symbols became their shackles. And the children, they were shaped by it too. The cycle repeated. The nursery door creaks. Shut behind you, not slammed. Just sealed. You descend the back stairs no narrower, steeper, uncarpeted. These were not meant for visitors. Your hand brushes the wall for balance, catching faint swirls of soot where fingers have passed for decades. There's a scent down here you can't quite place. Damp brick, stew, iron polish, sweat. Welcome to the servant's domain. The kitchen and scullery unfold before you like a sunless stage set. There's a clatter in your ears, ghost sounds, now pans, swinging, knives tapping, the stern bark of a cook yelling for more flour. You're surrounded by surfaces meant for toil, scrubbed pine tables, cast iron ranges, chopping blocks scored with 1,000 meals worth of desperation. This is the machine that powered the house, the engine room, and it ran on the labor of women. You reach for a cracked jug and turn it in your hands. A faded name is scratched into the underside. EM 1873. Probably a scullery maid. Probably aged 15. Probably awake before dawn and asleep long after midnight, if at all. Here's your mainstream. History fix. Victorian domestic service employed more women than any other profession in the 19th century. By 1851, 1 in 3 women under 25 was in service, not by ambition, by necessity. And these weren't just the downstairs caricatures you see in costume dramas. They were cooks, housemaids, nursemaids, laundrymaids, parlormaids, chambermaids, and always under watch. Because even down here, the house had eyes. A housekeeper oversaw the women. A butler watched the housekeeper. And above them all, the lady of the house might descend once a week to inspect the silver, as if control could be polished. Now here's the fringe tidbit. Some large homes had moral staircases separate. narrow staircases that prevented male and female servants from crossing paths too freely. Victorian architects literally wove gender segregation into the floor plan. You peek into the scullery, rows of dripping dishcloths, enormous copper pots, the blackened mouth of an old water heater. A rusted mangle leans against the wall, used to squeeze water from linens. Looks like something from a horror film, and frankly it was. Laundry was brutal. Boiling, lye-soaking, wringing, starching, drying, ironing. And if anything went wrong, a handkerchief went missing or a stain wouldn't lift, it wasn't the linen that got blamed. It was the girl. Always the girl. You brush your hand across the edge of a table and come away with a fine grit of flour. You imagine a cook here mid-30s, maybe, been in service since age 12, hands like leather, back like an old gate. She's both queen and prisoner of this space, because even though she rules this kitchen, her autonomy ends at the door. You. Want a scholarly wrinkle? Historians still argue whether the Victorian servant hierarchy gave working-class women a unique micro-authority, or simply bound them into a second-class patriarchy, where even the smallest freedoms had to be begged. 4. There's a bell system on the wall above you. A board of little brass ringtones, each labeled with a room: study, nursery, morning room, boudoir. If one rang, the correct maid would race up. No hesitation, no delay, abandonedly no refusal. You imagine the weight of that sound, the panic. That comes with being summoned. It wasn't just a call, it was a test. You could be dismissed for tardiness, or for looking a master in the eye too long, or for having the wrong kind of hair. And here's a twist. While most servants were women, the top positions like butler or valet went to men. Women served, men supervised. Sound familiar? But don't be fooled. There were rebellions. In 1879, newspapers whispered of a scandal where an entire house staff in Bath walked out after the lady of the house accused the laundrymaid of impropriety. A quiet strike, not a riot, but a refusal, and that, in Victorian terms, was nearly revolutionary. You step through into the pantry, where rows of jars still line the shelves. Dust clings to labels written in spidery script: gooseberry preserve, onion pickle, rhubarb cordial, preserved goods, preserved order. You can almost hear a tan argument between the cook and the parlor maid about the meat delivery being late. The low hiss of a kitchen maid venting over a chipped soup tureen. The hush that falls when the lady's heels click. Overhead, even here, underground, unseen, unhurt, the rules pressed in like damp on stone. The house was a system, a digestive tract, and women were the stomach, the lungs, the fingers, the nerve endings. Working, bending, enduring, but never credited. And if they left service, little options, no references meant no job. No job meant no food. No food meant the workhouse. Or worse, you take one last glance at the hearth. A small kettle still hangs. Over ashes that haven't felt fire in a century, the silence feels heavier here, like it knows it used to be filled with footsteps. You exhale slowly. This house didn't just trap its lady of the manor. It devoured its servants, too. You're back upstairs now, but not quite free. You step into what looks like an innocent hallway, bright with filtered sunlight, lined with pastoral prints and papered in damask. But don't be fooled. This isn't a corridor. It's a corridor. Of WATCHFUL-ness. Here, the house becomes something else entirely. A labyrinth of surveillance. Everything is hushed. Carpets deaden your footsteps. Our doors sit closed, some ever so slightly ajar, while others feel like they're watching you. The doors. Because behind them is where the real Victorian power play unfolded. The art of being seen without being seen. Here's your mainstream history anchor. Victorian society thrived on appearances. Visibility was currency. A woman's behavior even, in her own home, had to project modesty, virtue, gentility, not only to guests, but to staff, family, and heaven help her visiting clergy. Entire homes were designed to facilitate this performance. Take the drawing room, for example. Think of it as the Instagram of 1863, all curated and controlled, only the best objects on display. Only the best posture permitted. A chaise longue wasn't just for reclining. It was for elegant swooning. Faint was only proper if it occurred. Next to an oil portrait of one's grandmother, you glance into one such room now. Sunlight pools on the rug like melted gold. A harp gleams in the corner, almost untouched, of course. Its presence mattered more than its music. A cluster of porcelain figurines sits in a locked vitrine. No dust, no fingerprints, no fun. Now, here's the quirky tidbit. Victorian homes often had surprise mirrors, strategically placed to catch one's reflection unexpectedly, encouraging self-monitoring. A woman passing through might catch a flash of her own corseted waist or carefully arranged curls and, in that split second, correct any unbecoming slouch. It wasn't just guests watching. It was you, watching yourself, through the house's own cunning reflections. And lest you forget, behind many of these walls, servants' passageways ran parallel, narrow, creaky, and lined with peepholes. You could be observed without ever knowing it. The home was a panopticon in calico. The dining room tells another part of the story. Here, women performed the role of gracious hostess, charming dinner guests, while decoding the language of silverware. Elbows off the table. Don't eat faster than the men. Don't correct your husband, even if he calls the fish turbot instead of brill, and should someone arrive. Unexpectedly, the entire household transformed into theater troupe on cue. The drawing room filled with gentle laughter. The parlor maid announced names. The lady rose with serene detachment, her panic over the guest's name erased in one breathless second. Historians still argue whether the spatial design of Victorian homes elevated middle-class women through domestic queenship or simply turned them into highly trained social performers with zero off-stage time. You continue walking another door. This one leads into the morning room. A little feminine sanctuary, right? Tea letters, embroidery? But no, not entirely. It was a controlled space. A space where a woman could exercise tiny slivers of autonomy correspondence. Its household accounts, children's schedules, but always within sight. Her freedom was measured, timed, and witnessed. The walls here are covered in hand-printed floral wallpaper, soft greens and blush tones. The fireplace is modest, but elegant. A writing desk sits near the window, a lace cloth thrown across it, ink bottle uncorked. You pick up the pen. It's dry. This room was a compromise, womanhood reduced to management, not liberty. You could calculate the bread order, but not open your own bank account. You could write letters, but not vote. You could schedule your daughter's piano lessons, but never decide her future. And oh, the letters. It's estimated that in the Victorian era, more than 2 billion letters were sent in Britain alone. Many of those were written by women in rooms just like this. Courting letters. Letters to sisters. Carefully composed, always conscious of their reader. Even in private ink, a woman had to maintain her posture, and the moment a man entered this space, the atmosphere shifted. She stood, he sat, her pen stopped, his opinions filled the room. The hierarchy was spatial and psychologically inbuilt. Directly into the floor plan, don't believe it? Look up the design of double parlors to side-by-side reception rooms. With one designated for male discussion read, cigars and politics, and the other for female company read, embroidery and gossip. Same house, same family. Different air. You glance toward a cabinet filled with little luxuries perfume bottles, ivory-handled scissors, a silver thimble. They look charming, dainty, but they tell a story too. They speak of a life where their tools at your disposal were soft, ornamental, and small. A man wielded a compass or a ledger. A woman wielded a darning needle. Still, she had presence. Don't mistake monitored for powerless. A woman might not own the walls around her, but she learned how to read between them. And in those coded pauses, those glances, those silences, she carved out fragments of will, but always under the gaze, and always in rooms designed to frame her, not free her. You pause in the hall once more. The mirrors glint, the doorframes seem to lean in, and you suddenly feel it, again that faint pressure of being watched. Not by a person, by the house itself. You leave the soft, shadowed hallway behind and descend a narrow staircase, half hidden behind a damask curtain. The air cools. The wallpaper fades. Welcome to the backstairs world, the one a Victorian lady was never quite meant to see, but which governed her life nonetheless. You're now entering the servants' domain, and it's more than just a floor below. It's a completely different reality. The walls are bare. The floorboards creak in protest, and the ceiling, barely tall, enough for a man to stand upright. Everything down here whispers economy, speed, control. Here, function trumps form, and movement is constant. Here's your mainstream fact. In a respectable Victorian household, domestic service was the largest category of employment for women. Millions of women, many starting as young as 12, spent their lives moving silently through homes like this one. Cooking, scrubbing, starching, sewing, lifting, cleaning.
Nice.
Always behind the scenes. Always beneath the family they served. But here's the twist. Those women often knew more about a lady's life than she knew herself. Step into the narrow kitchen. The air is dense with yesterday's stew and coal smoke. An enormous iron range takes up nearly an entire wall. Pans hang like armor. A wooden table, its surface worn smooth, is scattered with crumbs and a half-peeled onion. It's not quiet. Down here it can't be. This is the beating heart of the house. The engine room and Yedu weren't supposed to hear it, or even acknowledge it. That's the central contradiction. A Victorian woman, for all her delicacy, depended utterly on the labor of other women, often of lower class, often of younger age. She might float through parlors with a teacup in hand, but someone had to polish that cup, carry it up from the scullery, remove it before it made a stain on the doily. And this is where things get truly layered. Remember those discreet doorways? And tiny bells above each room? Those weren't just for summoning help. They were part of a deeply embedded architecture of invisible labor. The ideal servant was silent, fast, and out of sight. The ideal woman was graceful, passive, never reminded of what made her comfort possible. But of course, she knew. You wander now into the servants' corridor, lined with hooks for cloaks, aprons, and keys. The housekeeper's office looms at the end, a strange blend of command center and confessional. You peek inside. There's a large desk covered in account books and a heavy ledger, its spine broken from use. This was the nerve center for the real economy of the home, and many mistresses didn't control it, you see. While the lady of the house represented social display, the housekeeper often ran the internal empire. Budgeting, wages, stock ordering, disciplining maids. In many cases, she answered only to the man of the house. Historians still argue whether this division between housekeeper and mistress gave elite women a sense of shared authority or simply created another layer of gendered hierarchy. Class wedged in the middle. Here comes your quirky tidbit. Some houses employed a still room maid, whose entire job was to prepare non-alcoholic drinks, herbal tonics, preserves, and sometimes even cosmetics. Essentially, a barista apothecary. Her domain was the still room, a tiny tucked-away corner where potions bubbled. Lemons were candied, and elderflower cordials cooled in glass bottles. But few guests even knew it existed. Now, imagine the irony. Youth a proper Victorian woman. Upstairs might sip elderflower syrup in the drawing room, praising its delicacy, without ever seeing the 14-year-old girl who stirred it for an hour in a windowless alcove. And then there's the nursery, another controlled zone, both for the children and the women tending them. You reach it now, tucked near the top floor. Far from the heart of the house, the wallpaper here is faded, peeling at the edges. Toys lie scattered like fossils from someone else's childhood. A rocking horse lists slightly to one side. For many women, especially those of the middle class, this room was both sanctuary and exile. Once you had children, this was where you were often sensitive, not physically, then socially. Motherhood was framed as the highest ideal, but it also meant separation from public life, from conversation, from agency. You hear a creak, a ghost of footsteps. Was that a child or a nursemaid? Because even here, even in motherhood, someone else did the heavy lifting, the wet nurse, the nursery maid, the governess. You were there for moral guidance and photo portraits. They were there at 3 a.m. with the clean linen and the cold porridge. Sometimes a governess would live in the attic, eat alone, and be treated neither as servant nor family. It was an unspoken class limbo, close to the children, but too educated. To scrub floors, to pour to attend the dinner party. The house reflected all of this. Every staircase, every servant's bell, every locked door mapped a hidden system of class and gender control. You return now to the main corridor, your footsteps growing louder. There's something deeply unnerving in this realization, isn't there? That a woman might live her entire life in a home, her home, and yet remain unaware of how expertly it managed her. Not just through velvet curtains and bone china, but through the invisible movements of others, through walls that absorbed every whisper, through footsteps she wasn't meant to hear. And maybe that's the real twist, because even today, you'd probably still live in a house shaped by these ghosts. You're standing now in the drawing room, the social heart of the Victorian home. The hearth is flickering, low flames licking at coal, and the scent of beeswax polish clings to every surface. Ornate sofas curve like question marks, their cushions. Plump, but never truly comfortable. And there you are, perched on the edge of one, stiff in a whalebone corset, gloved hands folded in your lap, listening. Always listening, because this is where a Victorian woman was meant to shine. But not too brightly. The drawing room was your stage and your prison. Every curtain swish, every tea pour, every half-laugh was a performance. You weren't here to speak your mind. You were here to reflect your husband's success, your family's values, your home's purity. One false note, a too loud laugh, a political opinion, an opinion at Allen you might find yourself the subject of whispers rather than the speaker of them. Here's your mainstream fact. The Victorian drawing room was a gendered space, a realm of polite society and rigid social code. Men had their clubs and studies, but women were confined to these perfumed salons, expected to entertain, impress, and remain spotless figuratively and literally. A woman could be clever, witty even, but only within bounds. The moment her intellect slipped from parlor games to pointed opinions, the room cooled. Because intelligence in a woman, that was dangerous, and the room reflected that. You notice it now, the tightly arranged seating. No one could move freely here. No slouching, no wandering. Every movement controlled. Even the windows, with their heavy brocade drapes, are more ornament than function. The light is filtered, like you. But let's not forget the oddities that lived within this perfect little world. Quirky fact time. Some women, denied formal education, and locked into domestic roles, turned to the language of flowers florography as an emotional outlet. You'd gift a bouquet of yellow roses jealousy, or tuck forget-me-nots into a calling card devotion, or wear heliotrope to signal eternal love. It was passive rebellion disguised as perfume. Every vase in this room could be hiding a secret message, just as every hostess was hiding herself. Now, the drawing room had an equally important function. Supervised courtship. You weren't allowed to be alone with a man unless someone, usually your mother, or a sister, or an aunt sat nearby, accidentally absorbed in her needlepoint. Remember the ridiculous notion of the marriage market? Well, this room was your showroom. Victorian girls were expected to master piano pieces, but not too passionately, speak French but not politically, and paint but never nude figures. This was the space where all of that came to life and was judged. You were a living resume in silk and lace, historians still argue. Whether women used these drawing rooms to build quiet power, using social influence and matchmaking to manipulate outcomes, or whether they were simply performing roles with no true agency. Either way, the stakes were high. And here's the catch. Even once married, even after you'd secured your place, the drawing room remained your domain, not your husband's study, not the world outside. This room hemmed in by velvet gilded frames and polite fiction was your kingdom. In your cage, you turn toward the fireplace. Above it hangs a watercolor soft pinks and blues, a pastoral scene, utterly unthreatening. You squint. Is that a woman lying on the grass? She has no face, Odd, isn't it? It's how many women, real women, lived faceless lives in rooms just like this. And yet, there was resistance here too. Lean a little closer to that side table. Beneath a stack of magazines, the Ladies' Monthly Museum. Gaudie's Ladies' Book, there's a worn, hand-bound journal. You open it. Scrawled inside. In iron gall ink, if I cannot leave, I will write. And if I cannot speak, I will sing. Your skin prickles. Not every Victorian woman was silent. Not every drawing room was docile. Some hosted forbidden discussions, literary salons, even covert political meetings. You had to know the code, of course, know how to fold your opinion into the crease of a compliment. But it happened. You step back from the journal. The room, for all its constraints, pulses with hidden tension. Suppressed ambition. Rewritten desire. Everything here is curated for appearances. Yet behind every cushion and candlestick, a story simmers. A woman sighs. A secret is buried. You walk slowly to the doorway. The edge of the carpet is frayed. Someone has stood there, often waiting, perhaps longing, listening to a conversation she wasn't part of, or wishing she could start one of her own. Because for all its elegance, the drawing room wasn't just about hospitality. It was about performance, correction, silencing. And you learned to stay perfectly still, to smile just wide enough to listen on, never interrupt, to be visible, but never too much. Even now, as you leave the room, silence clings to your shoulders, and you wonder how many generations learned to disappear here, to sit in that chair, to arrange the flowers, to open their mouths only to say, "Shall I pour the tea?" Maybe that's why this room feels colder than the rest. It has heard too many stories that were never allowed to finish. You take a few careful steps and find yourself at the base of the staircase, the true spine of the Victorian home. It rises before you in gentle spirals, polished mahogany banister gleaming under the flicker of gaslight. But don't be fooled by the elegant curve. The staircase was not just for climbing, it was for surveillance. In a Victorian house, the stairway wasn't merely functional, it was symbolic. It divided the home, not just by height, but by power. Downstairs was the domain of men, public, performative, loud. Upstairs, that was where you, the woman, retreated. Separate, unseen. The deeper your life pulled upward, the more invisible you became. Here's your mainstream fact. Victorian houses were meticulously stratified by floor, with each level reflecting a different tier of privacy and often of social value. The parlor. And drawing rooms were downstairs open to guests, structured for formality. The bedrooms and nurseries were upstairs, intimate, domestic, feminine. Movement between them wasn't casual. It was coded, and so were you. You weren't supposed to clatter up the stairs, or descend them too quickly. Your hem should brush the carpet lightly. Your posture must stay upright but not assertive. The staircase was a catwalk and a checkpoint. Any bold movement could signal something unseemly, indecent, or worst of all, independent. Now, here's your quirky detail. Some households actually designed staircases with whispering steps, creaky boards placed intentionally to catch servants or daughters trying to sneak in or out. Privacy? A charming modern concept? In the 19th century, everything was meant to be overheard by someone, and if not heard, then seen. Ever notice how many Victorian staircases are open? No solid walls to conceal your ascent, just ornamental spindles. The message was clear. Movement should be observed, and by extension, behavior controlled. You pause halfway up. Gust of cooler air drifts down from the upper landing. The house seems to hush around you. Do you remember being a young girl, sending these very stairs under your mother's eye, on your way to change before guests arrived? The way she reminded you to straighten your back, to keep your chin level? It wasn't just posture she was correcting it. It was posture as morality. Slouch, and you might be mistaken for willful. Walk too confidently, and someone might think you're trying to attract attention. Historians still argue whether these architectural divisions were deliberately misogynistic, or merely a product of broader Victorian values. But either way, the result was the same. You were watched. And here's the cruel irony. while you were being monitored for every step and every slip. Your brother. He could thunder up and down these stairs without reproach. Boys were expected to be noisy, boisterous, ambitious. You, graceful, contained, silent. Some days you lingered on these stairs longer than necessary, pretending to tie a sash, fix a hem anything to buy a moment of stillness. Because once you reached the top, your work wasn't over. The nursery, the sewing room, the endless domestic duties waited. Even rest was a chore. A small, worn patch on the third step makes your foot wobble slightly. That imperfection has been there forever. It was never fixed. Maybe because fixing it would mean admitting how often it was used. How heavily those unspoken rules pressed on every ascent and descent. There was one trick, though. A quiet rebellion. Women would sometimes use the stairs to pass messages, folded and dropped behind balusters, notes tucked beneath rugs. There's even a rumor about one governess who faked a sprained ankle just to avoid escorting the children and have a moment of silence in the guest room below. The staircase was rigid, but clever minds could still find angles in its curves. You take another step upward. Gaslight flickers above, casting long shadows on the landing. There's an empty chair tucked beside a plant stand, a place where someone's mother likely sat, embroidery in hand, pretending not to listen to the muffled voices drifting from the drawing room. Eyes sharp, ears sharper, upstairs. Everything was monitored, and you internalized it. There's a famous phrase from the period, the angel in the house. It wasn't about wings. It was about disappearing quietly into domestic perfection. Women were expected to glide through these spaces like ghost-guiding, soothing, caretaking, but never demanding. And so the staircase wasn't just a threshold, it was a filter. As you climbed, you shed layers of selfhood. Out went the loud laugh, the untamed thought, the footstep that wasn't careful. Up here you became smaller, but not always. You reach the top landing now, and something shifts. Maybe it's the dust motes drifting through a shaft of gaslight. Maybe it's memory. What you recall, nights spent here alone, after everyone had gone to bed, sitting, quietly reading by stolen candlelight. Jane Eyre, perhaps, or The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. Books that whispered, you don't have to stay small. And that's where the staircase betrays its masters, because every step might lead to control. But it also leads to height, to solitude, to dreams, to the possibility of looking down on it all. You've reached the upstairs hallway now, the hush up here as thick as the floral wallpaper. Every step you take is muffled by runner rugs, stitched with forget-me-nots and vines. You walk past the nursery door ajar, rocking chair still then. The guest bedroom, and finally your own room, which is where it all truly happens, where the transformation is finalized. Because Victorian bedrooms weren't sanctuaries, they were observatories, not of the stars of women. Here's your mainstream fact. In Victorian architecture, women's bedrooms were often situated near nurseries, or at the end of isolated hallways, away from the central traffic of the household. This wasn't just for peace and quiet, it was to reinforce a very specific script. Wife, mother, caretaker, always close to the children, always available, never the center of attention. Open the door to your room now, as you left it. The high bed with carved walnut posts. The dressing table crowded with combs and scent bottles. The window seat, embroidered in blue and cream. Everything looks gentle. Everything smells like lavender. But you know the truth. This is the most regulated room in the house. For a woman, her bedroom was not where she relaxed, it was where she was examined. Where she prepared herself for display, where she maintained the delicate machinery of respectability. The corset hangs limply on the bedpost, but its presence dominates the space. And speaking of quirks, here's one. Some wealthier households installed modesty panels or gauzy screens between the bedroom and dressing area so that servants could assist without ever seeing too much. The irony, of course, is that while they couldn't glimpse your bare shoulders, they absolutely saw the bruises your stays left behind. Privacy was always performative, and let's not forget the dreaded calling bell system, those little cords near the bed or dressing table that let you summon a maid with a simple tug. But here's the catch. You were expected to use it not only when you needed help, but when someone else wanted to observe your propriety. Ring for your maid, your mother would say, so she can help you into something more appropriate. Translation, so someone can witness you conforming. Historians still debate whether women found power in their boudoirs through control of their appearance, or their command of a private dominor, whether it was just another gilded cage. After all, the room wasn't truly yours. Your father designed it, your husband paid for it, your maid maintained it, and your reputation lived and died by it. You sit now at the dressing table. The mirror is framed in gold-painted wood, slightly foxed in the corners. You remember watching yourself here at 16, twisting your hair just so, checking for any sign of rebellion in your own eyes. You never found any, or did you? It's funny, because while this room seems built to contain you, it's also where your mind roamed farthest, where letters were written and then hidden, where novels were read under covers by candlelight, where you practiced saying things out loud that you never dared speak downstairs, like no, or I don't want to marry him. Of course, you never said it when it counted. That's what bedrooms were for, to soften your will. The canopy bed still creaks when you sit. The mattress is stuffed with horsehair and dreams deferred. You stare up at the ceiling medallion, a painted rosette, ringed in plaster swirls, and wonder, as you did so often, whether there was something more, something beyond this floor, this hallway, this version of you, and still. Despite the scrutiny and the routine, you carved out slivers of space. There was that secret drawer in the dressing table where you kept your contraband penny novels, that spot under the window seat cushion where your poetry journal hid. You've even learned how to apply just the right amount of face powder to hide tired eyes. Without inviting accusations of vanity, you became fluent in the dialect of subtle defiance. Sometimes, late at night, you'd hear the boards creak in the hallway outside. Was it your sister sneaking a book? Your mother checking doors? Or maybe your own footfalls in a dream, pacing the boundary between who you were and who you longed to be? There's one final, quietly cruel trick to the Victorian bedroom. It was also the sick room. When you were ill, you were expected to recover or languish here, away from the family's sight. You'd be attended by doctors who spoke over you, and nurses who administered potions you hadn't agreed to. Sometimes women didn't come back down those stairs because in the end, this room was never truly yours. It was a chrysalis designed, not for emergence but containment. But oh, how fiercely you dreamed inside it. You step out of the bedroom, closing the door with a soft click that somehow echoes louder than it should. The upstairs corridor stretches before you like a spinal cord of the house, connecting everything yet keeping emotions neatly compartmentalized. You descend the stairs again slowly this time, because what waits below is not a place for dreaming. It's the drawing room now.
Ow.
This is where appearances are sharpened into weapons, where you entertain, where you host, where you as a proper Victorian woman perform the quiet ballet of civility, charm, calculated silence. You lower yourself gracefully onto the settee, careful not to crush your skirt. You know your posture matters more than your opinions here. Room smells faintly of beeswax and violet water. Furniture's delicate, the upholstery floral. And everything is arranged with mathematical precision, not for comfort, but for presentation. Here's your mainstream fact. Drawing rooms were typically designed to showcase the family's taste and refinement, often featuring imported furniture, polished wood, and a piano to suggest cultural accomplishment, particularly of the daughters. And here's a quirk for you. Some Victorian drawing rooms were constructed with acoustics in mind, not for music, but so that male heads of household could overhear female conversations from the study or hall. Paranoia disguised as paternal concern. Surveillance disguised as chivalry. So, while you sat with teacups balanced delicately in your lap, laughing softly and speaking in restrained tones, someone might be listening, watching, measuring your volume, your laugh, your opinions, or lack thereof. Historians still argue whether women found genuine companionship in drawing rooms. Perhaps these feminine spaces, despite their ornamental roles, allowed women to support and confide in each other. Whether such rooms simply rehearsed the pageantry of upper-class obedience. You glance toward the door. You know the rules? No loud laughter, no controversial topics, no talk of politics or bodily discomfort, and God forbid you show boredom. It's practically social treason. You're meant to smile and nod while Uncle Henry rehashes his hunting stories, and your neighbor praises the Queen's moral fortitude. What's ironic, though, is that this space so obsessed with control, of cracked first, drawing rooms, were pressure chambers. Here's where the fainting happened, not from tight corsets alone, but from the emotional stifling. Here's where secrets slipped out between sips of Earl Grey. Affairs, scandals, deaths, illness, deaths, covered in embroidery and idle chatter. Even the decor plays a psychological game. The mirror over the fireplace is perfectly placed to reflect. You always use it improperly, reacting properly. You're part of the ornamentation. And don't forget that little footstool beneath your hem. Women weren't supposed to let their shoes touch the floor while sitting in company. Too masculine, too grounded. So instead, you floated, disconnected, disembodied. Almost unreal. You run your fingers along the fringe of a cushion and remember the feeling of threading needles in this room while older relatives gossiped. Your embroidery hoop sat in your lap like a miniature stage. You've stitched roses and doves while half listening, half plotting the life you might lead outside this parlor if one ever existed. A cough from the doorway. It's only your maid, announcing tea is served. She sets the tray on the inlaid side. Table with a quiet clink of porcelain. Even she's part of the room's choreography. You thank her, though your voice barely rises above the ticking of the mantel clock. Do you remember the first time you tried to make a joke in this room? Something clever about the vicar's hypocrisy? The silence that followed was deafening. Your aunt sipped her tea like it was poison. Your mother's smile didn't reach your eyes. You didn't make that kind of joke again, and yet, despite the suffocating decorum, this is where alliances were made. Marriages arranged, futures brokered. The drawing room wasn't just a cage, it was also a stage. If you played your role perfectly, you could earn certain freedoms. A better match, a visit abroad, larger allowance for books. Assuming they weren't French, you shift on the seat. The settee creaks, the room watches. Even now, decades later, when you walk through antique stores or tours old houses, you can smell the air of that drawing room. You can feel the invisible corset, the social one wrapped tight again. It squeezes your lungs and pinches your ribs in all the places where you dared to dream. Something different. But you also remember this. One night, when the gas lamps burned low and most of the guests had gone, you sat on this very sofa beside your younger cousin, who whispered that she wanted to be a doctor. You gasped, then laughed, but not in mockery. In awe, in recognition, and you whispered back, "Then you will be." Because sometimes in the most performative spaces, the realest things are said. The teacups rattle as the maid clears them away. Another call echoes from the hall. Time to stand. Time to nod. Time to return to the script. You do. But you never forget the whispers in this room. Not ever. You drift from the drawing room to the dining room, the transition as seamless as lace unspooling across polished floorboards. But the air changes the moment you enter thicker, more theatrical. Everything here is darker, heavier. It smells of roast meat, beeswax polish, and the faint metallic temps of silverware, too long unused. The long mahogany table stretches like a battlefield. 16 chairs, maybe more, arranged like sentinels. The curtains are velvet, dusty rose or forest. Green, depending on the season, and always drawn just enough to tint the light like old wine. A chandelier hangs overhead, its crystals dimmed by soot, fracting candlelight into tiny fractured halos. The dining room, you realize, is not about food. It's about performance. Rank, power, silence. Here's your mainstream fact. Victorian. Dining rooms were often located toward the rear of the house and reserved for formal meals. Where social rituals followed strict rules, seating was assigned by status. Conversation dictated by etiquette manuals. Courses delivered with military precision. In your strange tidbit, many households installed special bell pull systems beneath the dining table, allowing the mistress of the house to summon servants without breaking eye contact or betraying movement. It was discretion, disguised as divinity. You could command an entire kitchen with the flick of a wriststiff. You were trained in invisibility. Now you sit at the head of the table. Or maybe 3 places down, depending on your marital status, your husband's income, or whether your dowry ever arrived from your father's failing estate. Either way, you sit, you wait. Dinner is served in silence. You're not meant to eat. With appetite, you're meant to gracefully consume. One bite at a time. No elbows, no chewing sounds. Napkin in lap, knife in right hand, fork in left continental style. And for heaven's sake, no speaking until the lady of highest rank initiates. You sip soup, carefully. This room, more than any other, is where domestic hierarchy becomes architectural. Historians still argue whether dining rooms functioned more as tools of male dominance or mutual performance, a kind of theater where everyone knew their part but also knew how precariously it was all held together. There's something almost religious about the table, isn't there? The weight of the candlesticks. The decanter standing sentinel like a priest. The way servants glide in and out like ghosts. You're meant to be grateful for their silence. But you've caught them exchanging looks. You know, they see everything. You've tried just once, to offer a joke during a Sunday roast. A harmless quip about overcooked lamb. But your father-in-law didn't laugh. He raised a single eyebrow and changed the subject to tariffs. You think of the any are allowed at the table at all? In most houses, they dine separately in a nursery, far from the ritualized tedium of adult company. The few times you've seen them enter this room, they resemble porcelain, dolls washed, stiff, and coached to death. Your own hands rest against the cold linen tablecloth. You realize the salt shaker is an heirloom cut glass and sterling. You remember being told never to handle it too roughly. It belonged to your husband's grandmother, and she would have cried to see it dropped. There are stories beneath this. Table literal ones. You've heard of women scribbling poetry against their thighs, of love notes passed beneath the napkins, of feet touching scandalously under the oak. One countess in 1872 was supposedly banished from her own home for tapping her shoe rhythmically under the table. Her husband claimed it was sexual rebellion. You don't know whether that's true, but you believe it. The dining room is both stage and trap. The curtains are too heavy to move easily. The air gets thick. The hearth is often more for show than heat. You find yourself adjusting your position, not for comfort, but for posture. Chin lifted, shoulders gently back. Breasts rising against corset stays not enough to provoke. It's just enough to impress. And then the conversation starts. It's never spontaneous. It's a waltz. Politics, lightly. Religion, cautiously. A discussion of a foreign opera or a new painting on exhibit. But not too new, not too modern. You nod along. You've read the reviews, if not the works. You quote one line from the paper and hope no one asks follow-up questions. Sometimes you glance across the table and meet the eyes of another woman, your sister-in-law, perhaps. You see the same look you're wearing? A calm mask, and behind it, the frantic flapping of thoughts. How much longer? Is this worth it? Do I look bored? You reach for the wine. Of course, you sip, not drink. It wouldn't do to be seen as indulgent, or worse, emotional. But you let the red touch your lips and imagine for a brief moment it's blood. Not yours. Not anyone's. Just symbolic. A little rebellion in a crystal goblet. And when the servants finally clear the last course, usually a fruit compote or a pudding you pretended to enjoy, you excuse yourself. The men stay behind. For port. For cigars. For serious matters. You smile, stand, and glide from the room as expected. You're expected to forget what's said after dessert. But you don't. You remember the silence, the strain, the secret. Messages of a raised eyebrow or a lowered gaze, and you remember the sound of your own heartbeat. Slow and steady under layers of lace and self-dash restraint, it still echoes, long after the plates are cleared. You step out of the dining room and into what should be relief a lounge, a parlor, a place for gentle repose. But it isn't. It's something else. This, you realize, is the ladies' withdrawing room. In the moment you cross the threshold, The air shifts again, lighter perhaps but only superficially. This room is pastel where the dining room was oak. Sofas are rounded, not rigid. There's needlepoint everywhere. A tea tray waits like a trusted confidant. And yet the sense of scrutiny doesn't leave you. You perch on a low divan, not because it's comfortable, but because it's expected. Everything in here is expected. Everything in here is performance. Here's your mainstream historical fact. After formal dinners, it was standard practice for Victorian women to withdraw to a separate room, leaving the men behind to smoke cigars, drink port, and discuss business or politics. You were supposed to be above all that, below it, somehow to dot your fringe tidbit. In more progressive or eccentric households, these so-called withdrawing rooms became clandestine salons where women would read subversive novels, critique parliament under hushed tones, or even remove their corsets under the guise of a headache. The revolution, it seemed, often started with peppermint tea and feigned fainting. You look around, embroidered pillows, china figurines, a harp no one plays. And yet this room carries its own form of tyranny. You're meant to speak now, but only of proper things. A new hat maker on King Street, a poem you almost understood. The way you're new. Maid does not fold linens like your old one did. No one mentions that your corset has bruised your ribs, or that the meat was undercooked, or that your husband's hand lingered a moment too long on the waist of the scullery maid. All of that is invisible. Like most of the truth in this house, the fire crackles in the grate. You stare into it. This is the only room where you're allowed to be openly feminine without suspicion. But femininity here means passivity. You knit, you nod, you pour the tea. Keep the teacup low so as not to obscure your mouth when you speak. Men don't like voices that arrive without warning. Someone mentions a new serialized novel by Mrs. Gaskell. You try to recall whether it's one you're supposed to like or condemn. The conversation flutters like lace in a breeze, each woman careful not to blow too hard in any one direction. You stifle a yawn. It would be impolite. Historians still argue whether withdrawing rooms functioned as spaces of refuge or refined exile, whether they gave women space to breathe, or simply enclosed them in a softer prison. You remember once seeing a book here? Hidden under a cushion. The Subjection of Women by John Stuart Mill. You left it where you found it, but your pulse quickened. You still wonder who it belonged to. The women around you are smart. They speak in code. You've heard it. The way one lady praises the restraint of a painting when she really means the artist had no idea how to paint women. Or how another will laugh too long at a joke to fill the space where something real almost slipped through. You are fluent in this language now. You hate that. One woman, blonde, delicate, chronically widowed, leans over and whispers, "We only get 15 minutes before they come in with port breath and opinions." Stifle a smile. She's dangerous. She survived more than one husband and still wears colors too bold for her complexion. You like her? There's a single window cracked open behind the floral curtain, just enough breeze to stir your fringe. The air smells faintly of the garden, earth, and roses. The outside world. You imagine walking straight through the French doors and never looking back. You imagine stepping barefoot into the grass and feeling it, for once, without permission. But instead, you pass the sugar. The ticking of the mantel clock announces the end of your reprieve. The men will enter soon. You feel your shoulders brace for it. You don't even realize you're doing it until it's too late, and then they arrive. They enter with a waft of brandy and entitlement. Their voices are louder than necessary. Their jokes not meant to be understood. They pat your shoulders. They kiss foreheads they never look directly into. The room tilts again, back toward masculinity, and you begin to disappear. You pour more tea. You remember to smile. You count the seconds between now and bed. You don't speak of what was discussed in this room. You barely even remember it. Next day. Not because you're forgetful, but because this room was designed to make your voice so gentle it erases itself. A single teacup clinks against its saucer. The only applause you're allowed. You retreat upstairs under the weight of velvet drapes and fading civility. The steps creak beneath your slippers. Each groan of the wood another whispered reminder, you are being watched. even when you think you're not. Now you're heading toward the one place that's supposed to be yours, the bedroom, your domain, your sanctuary, so they say. The door closes behind you with a soft click, and at last you're alone. Sort of. Your maid follows, of course. Quiet as snowfall. Shh. Your rhythm's better than your mother ever did. She unhooks your corset with the precision of a surgeon and the delicacy of a dancer. You inhale. For the first time all day, your lungs expand. Ribs sigh. Muscles unknot. A freedom measured in inches. Here's your mainstream historical fact, Victorian. Bedrooms weren't simply for sleeping. They were the final stage in a long daily theater of gender, power, and routine. Women's bedrooms were both their only private spaces and their final points of surveillance. Your fringe tidbit? In wealthier households, it was common to install discreet speaking tubes that allowed the master of the house or the housekeeper to communicate directly with the servants' quarters. And yes, sometimes to listen, 'cause silence in a Victorian home was not absence, it was a test. You slip into a nightgown so stiff with lace and starch it crackles when you move. Comfort is irrelevant. Even in sleep, you must be tasteful. The bed is massive, four-posted, swaddled in layers of curtain and coverlet. A fortress, a cradle, a cage. You can't decide. Your maid brushes your hair, 100 strokes, slowly. She doesn't speak. You both know it's not her place. But her fingers linger just a moment too long on your temple, and in that pause, quiet mercy passes between you. Historians still argue whether the female bedroom represented a space of true solitude or merely another chamber in the domestic hierarchy, decorated softer, surveilled smarter. The fireplace crackles. Shadows dance along the carved ceiling medallions. You lie back, staring at the void between chandelier and crown molding. That gap has always unnerved you. It's where dust collects, where spiders build, where unseen things might linger, just above reach. This is your room, but it's not your world. Your husband has his own chamber, of course adjoining, with a discreet door connecting yours to his. When it opens, it never knocks first. You're expected to be receptive, decorous, fragrant. The walls are papered in. Pale green damask. It's meant to calm you. You hate it. Every flower repeats like a hymn, like a looped command. Be gentle. Be quiet. Be pleasing. And even in your exhaustion, it works. You fold into the bed like pressed linen. There's a writing desk by the window. You used to write there. Letters, thoughts, once even a poem. But that was before the letter you forgot. To lock away was read aloud at dinner by your husband, who thought it amusing. Since then, you keep your pen capped. Tonight, you pull the coverlet to your chin. Not for warmth it's July, but for armor. You stare at the ceiling roses. You count them. You listen for the creak of the door next to yours. You wonder if it will open tonight. Some nights it does. You imagine other women in other bedrooms. You imagine one climbing out the window, nightgown torn on the sill, feet hitting the grass without hesitation. She runs. Maybe to the city, maybe to the sea. She becomes a scandal, but a free one. But you stay. There's a copy of Wuthering Heights under your pillow, hidden. Your maid put it there. She knows. When you read it by candlelight, Heathcliff isn't just a Byronic lover, he's the only man in your life who speaks to a woman with fire. You don't like him? Exactly. But you envy him. The clock on the mantel chimes 11. A late hour. Your eyelids are heavy, and yet your mind loops. Did you speak too freely at dinner? Did your laughter carry too far in the withdrawing room? Will your husband knock tonight, or enter unannounced? You listen to the wind. You listen to your heartbeat. You try not to breathe too loud. You are a woman in a house built to contain you. Even now, even here, even in bed, you are not unobserved. The house remembers. The house reminds. 100 hair strokes. 2 corset hooks. 3 muffled sobs. Swallowed into a pillow you can't replace. Your maid closes the door behind her with the same reverence she opened it. You hear her steps retreat. You are alone again. You drift toward sleep, careful not to snore. It wouldn't. Be ladylike. Outside the window, the moon glances through the drapes. It, at least, is not beholden to anyone. You envy it too. Morning breaks like a spilled glass of milk, quiet, slow, and inevitable. You wake not to birdsong or sunbeams, but to the mechanical jingle of the servant bell in the hallway, and the low creak of someone lighting the downstairs fires. Your eyelids peel open. The curtains are still drawn, heavy damask sealing the light outside. You lie there a moment, listening. Below you, the house exhales into motion boots on floorboards. Clinking teacups, the dull thud of coal being shoveled. There's no alarm clock, but there doesn't need to be. This house has rhythms, and you are part of them. The door opens. You're made again, silent, efficient. She carries your hot water jug with both hands, careful not to spill on the Persian rug. You nod. She nods. The performance begins anew. Today's ritual begins at the dressing table, the shrine of transformation. You sit before a triptych mirror, like an actress in her green room, except you never leave the stage. Your corset waits on its stand, pale peach satin, gleaming faintly in the morning gloom. But before that comes the shift. The petticoats, the garters, the bustle cage. Layer by layer, you construct the version of you the world will tolerate. Here's your mainstream, historical fact. A well-to-do Victorian woman's day began with an hour or more of dressing, often assisted by a maid who had memorized the complex order of garments. These layers weren't just fashion, they were social armor, and your quirk for today. Some women kept journals noting their dressing combinations to avoid repeating outfits at important events like a chessboard of silk and strategy. Your corset is pulled tight. You do not speak during this. It's a kind of prayer. Your waist is cinched to 19 inches today. Respectable. Your husband once said, though he never tries it himself, you wonder what he'd say if you tightened his middle until he couldn't breathe without effort. Next comes the gown. It's pale dove-gray taffeta with glass buttons. You hate gray, but it's appropriate for a woman of your station, especially before noon. Pink is for girls. Red is for scandal. Black is for mourning, though many days you suspect it would suit your mood perfectly. You move to the hallway. You pass your husband's dressing room. He has a valet, a wardrobe of tailored suits, and the freedom to read the newspaper before speaking to anyone. You envy him that freedom from performance. Historians still argue whether the Victorian obsession with fashion was a form of patriarchal control or a sly tool women used to navigate rigid power structures. Perhaps both, perhaps neither. You're too busy holding your breath to ponder. Downstairs, breakfast is a ceremony. It's toast under a silver dome. Eggs served on Wedgwood. Tea poured just shy of boiling. You sit across from your husband, neither of you speaking until he clears his throat and asks whether the Macmillan girl was at the recital last night. Her dress was lavender and 2 seasons behind. You say this aloud, carefully, not because you care, but because it's what you're expected to notice. He nods, satisfied. The conversation shifts. You excuse yourself delicately. You don't eat much. Women with hearty appetites are vulgar. Besides, it's easier to maintain your corset line when your stomach is mostly empty. You step into the morning room. This room exists purely for feminine rituals, embroidery, quiet reading, polite calls. Even the furniture here is lighter, daintier, nothing designed to carry weight. Not the mahogany chairs, not the expectations. You pour yourself more tea, weak with lemon. You stare out the window. The garden is a work of manicured perfection. Every hedge trimmed, every rose ordered into a boxwood prison. It's beautiful. It's terrifying. Later, the cook will present you with the week's menus to approve. You don't cook, of course, but your opinion matters. You have dominion over digestion, if not over your own body. And speaking of dominion, the housekeeper approaches. She stands at a respectful distance and asks whether you'd like the blue damask curtains replaced this season. You say no, not because you care about the curtains, but because you're tired of choosing things you don't want. Upstairs, your maid is probably laundering your chemises. You wonder if she hates you. You wouldn't blame her. But then again, she brushes your hair with care. That has to mean something. You glance at the clock. 11:30. Soon the visiting hour will begin. Ladies will arrive. Gloves will be removed. Compliments will be exchanged like currency. And you will sit on the embroidered chaise, spine straight, voice soft, always smiling. None of them will know how tired you are. None of them will see the red marks beneath your corset. None of them will guess that last night you considered escaping through the servants' stairwells just to see how far you could get before someone stopped you. Your husband walks past the doorframe, his boots echoing in the hall. He doesn't glance inside. He doesn't need to. This is your realm, and you are where you should be. You sip your tea, arrange your face into a smile. The doorbell rings. It begins again. You barely notice the door open now. It's always the same. A gloved hand on the doorknob, a faint rustle of skirts, the obligatory trill of feminine pleasantries. Oh, you must tell me where you got those brooches. Darling, you won't believe what happened at the Avery luncheon. The morning room becomes a stage once again, and you're an actress whose lines are etched in bone. Smile, laugh lightly, nod at the right moment. Don't say anything too clever. They file in, your visitors. Mrs. Harrow, with her nasal laugh and her invisible marriage, is Priscilla eternally engaged to the idea of engagement. And Lady Bexford, a walking encyclopedia of social offenses committed by everyone but herself. You serve tea. You compliment hats. You absorb complaints about governesses and florists and the shocking price of KID gloves this season. You murmur sympathy when Mrs. Harrow admits her daughter has taken to reading novels without her mother's approval. Scandalous. But you're only half listening. Your mind floats toward the ceiling like smoke, staring at the plaster roses etched. They're in soft spirals. You've traced those curves with your eyes 1,000 times. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The Victorian visiting hour was a structured ritual, typically occurring between 3 and 5 p.m. for upper class women. It was governed by strict codes of etiquette: how long one stayed, how one dressed, who one was allowed to call on. The fringe detail? Some women sent their calling cards with a bent corner to signal specific messages like condolences or congratulations, all without ever stepping through the door. Social nuance by paper cut. Tell me, Miss Priscilla says, eyes wide with faux concern, is it true your sister spent last summer in Brighton? ... Alone. There it is. The jab you weren't expecting, though you should have. The room holds, its breath, awaiting your reaction. You sip your tea, you murmur. She enjoyed the sea air. Well deflected. Points awarded. Historians still argue whether these rituals of visitation were mechanisms of female empowerment, spaces where women ruled, or tools of internalized oppression, where women were trained to police one another's behavior with surgical precision. In truth, they were probably both. One of the women fans herself vigorously. It's stifling in here, don't you think? She says, though she's the one who insisted the windows remained shut to protect her complexion. You rise and tug open. The sash a half-inch, a rare defiance. The breeze that creeps in is faint but cool, enough to stir the lace on your collar. Lady Bexford eyes your hands. My dear, you must try lemon water for those. You follow her gaze, your fingertips are slightly red. The result of pinpricks from mending your son's favorite toy horse last night. Another thing no one sees you do. The visit drags. Time thickens. You wonder distantly what your male counterparts are doing right now. Their clubs, their studies, their carriages, smoking cigars, perhaps. debating tariffs or poetry or empire, all without corsets or judgmental glances. Are you hosting anyone this weekend? Someone asks. You say you are. You aren't, but it's easier to lie than to explain. Why your house feels too full and too hollow at the same time, when they finally leave, the silence claps like thunder. You sink into the chaise, remove your gloves, flex your fingers. True self slowly returning like blood to a sleeping limb, down the hallway. A floorboard creaks. Your daughter appears in the doorway. 8 years old, cheeks flushed, ribbon askew. She's holding a small watercolor, smudgy purples and pinks, a vague house. It's 2 stick figures holding hands. You beckon her closer. She climbs into your lap without hesitation, pressing the paper to your chest. It's us, she says. You nod. You trace the tiny figures with your fingertip. The one on the right wears a crown. The one on the left has a heart-shaped face. And what's this? You ask, pointing to a green patch. A garden, she says, but not neat. Just wild. You smile. For the first time today, it's not practiced. You look at your daughter, at her untamed hair and ink-smudged fingers, and the softness of her breath. She is still free, still unformed, still unshaped by the 1,000 tiny rules that cling to you like cobwebs. You feel the urge to protect her, but also quietly, secretly, you wonder how you might teach her to break the rules without getting caught. The painting goes into your desk drawer. Not hidden, just ... set aside. For later, you ring for the maid to bring a light supper tray. You tell her to take the long way to the kitchen. Enjoy the garden, you say. Looks surprised but nods. Her face softens. Even small freedoms feel like revolution. As the sun begins to set, you remove your corset with a sigh that fills the whole room. Your ribs expand. Your lungs reintroduce themselves. You stand at the window and watch the light turn honey-gold. Outside, a cat crosses. The lawn, not one you recognize. It moves without purpose. Or maybe it just doesn't have to explain itself. Lucky cat. You don't sleep well in the summer. It's not the heat, though the air feels like damp velvet by midnight. It's heavy with lilac and leftover noise. It's the noise inside your head. It's the unspooling of the day. The unraveling of a life lived according to the script of the house. You slip from bed, barefoot. The floor is cool beneath your feet, even through the plush rug. You don't light a lamp. You don't need to. You've walked this hallway more times than you can count. Downstairs, the house has stilled. The grandfather clock ticks like a metronome for ghosts. You pass by the drawing room, where the faintest scent of tobacco lingers from your husband's earlier brooding. But tonight, you go somewhere different. The conservatory. The house's glass heart, sanctuary of ferns and flowering vines and moonlight, turned silver on curved panes. It was supposed to be ornamental, a showcase for exotic plants and rarer guests. But you've made it into something else. A hiding place. You settle into the worn rattan chair beside the potted monstera and exhale, at last. Like a kettle taken off the flame, here's your mainstream historical fact. Conservatories became fashionable during the mid-19th century as signs of wealth and sophistication, often added to the rear of affluent Victorian homes. They were architectural indulgences, cast iron frames, sweeping domes, and acres of imported glass. But here's the fringe tidbit. No one writes into the blueprints. Many women use them not just for botanical showpieces, but for private reading. Painting, secret letter writing, sometimes simply weeping without witnesses. The conservatory has a different climate, you've noticed. It holds warmth longer than the rest of the house. Maybe because it was never meant to be part of the original plans, like your opinions. Just like your late-night wanderings. Tonight, you bring a book. Not a proper one. Of course, not the etiquette guides or the dull essays about English birds. This is poetry, the contraband kind. Verse that blushes in candlelight and says things no woman is supposed to say aloud. You read slowly. You let the lines linger. You imagine writing your own. Historians still argue whether the domestic spaces afforded women in Victorian homes were shelters or prisons. Some call them zones of feminine power, curated and controlled by mistresses of the house. Others say they were beautifully furnished cages. It's designed to keep restlessness at bay. Your conservatory knows which side it's on. A moth flutters against the glass. You watch it beat itself gently against the pane, seeking moonlight that won't yield. It reminds you of a dinner party last winter, when a gentleman described a woman's place as the hearthstone of moral civilization. You remember the silence afterward? The women smiled, the men nodded, you smiled too. But inside you thought, what if I want to be lightning instead? You closed the book. You whispered the last line aloud, tasting the words. I am not made of marble. It says, I crack, I bleed, I bloom. Your voice is soft, but it fills the glass room like steam. You lean back and stare at the rafters above, the ivy climbing toward the corners like it's trying to escape. Somewhere far off, a fox cries. Or maybe it's just a trick of the wind. Either way, you're glad for the sound. Something alive, something unscripted. Your feet ache. Gilt them under the hem of your nightgown and trace idle patterns on. Your skin. You think about the women in your family, your mother, your grandmother. You think about the spaces they were allowed to inhabit, kitchens, nurseries, needlework chairs, by half-lit windows. You wonder if any of them ever found a secret. Room like this? Probably not. You wonder what they'd think of you sitting here now. Reading forbidden lines? Dreaming not of husbands or linens or christenings, but of wild places and louder voices. The moth gives up. It flutters down into a pot of basil and vanishes. You envy it a little. Even surrender feels like a choice. Strange thing happens then. You smile. Not the social kind. Not the, I'm fine, thank you kind. But something quieter. A curve that rises from the core. Because for all the constraints, the corsets, the curtains, the etiquette, the endless rooms named for what you're supposed to do inside them, there's still this. A woman sitting in the middle of the night, under a canopy of stars and stained glass, thinking her own thoughts. That alone is a kind of rebellion. You stand. Your body protests, but softly. The book stays behind, resting on the seat like a sleeping cat. You'll return to it tomorrow. Or not. The moon dips lower. You walk barefoot back through the house, past the china cabinets and locked study doors, past the parlors and piano. The portraits of people who never questioned whether rooms could hold you prisoner. Upstairs, you pause outside your daughter's room. You open the door and step inside. She sleeps like someone who trusts the world. You press a kiss to her forehead. Her breath is warm. Her dreams are wild things, unruled by Victorian expectations. You promise, silently, to leave her more than parlors. You slip into your own room. The sheets are cold. You welcome it. And as your eyes flutter closed, you think, tomorrow, perhaps the sash windows will stay open all day. Perhaps the conservatory will host tea instead of gossip. Perhaps you'll write something of your own. Or perhaps not. But the thought is enough. Tonight, you chose yourself. You wake early. The sun is just brushing the tops of the hedges outside your bedroom window, casting a soft apricot glow across the lace curtains. It's quiet, unnervingly so, as if the house itself hasn't noticed you stirring yet. You lie there for a moment, letting the silence wash over you. This is the best time. The few stolen minutes before the house begins to demand things of you again. You stretch. The sheets whisper as you move. And in that moment, a single phrase loops gently in your mind. What if I don't answer today? Not out loud, of course, not to anyone in particular. But the question lingers, like the residue of a dream. You get up. You don't ring for the maid. You don't slip into the stiffer, corseted day dress right away. Instead, a looser wrapper silk, pale lilac, with tiny embroidered violets, something your mother called unfitting for company. But there's no company yet, and this morning your skin demands softness. Downstairs, the house is still asleep. Even the dog is curled beneath the butler's pantry table, breathing like a metronome. You walk past the formal breakfast room and make yourself tea in the scullery. The tin smells of bergamot and secrets, and they're at the head of the long dining table. where you're rarely allowed to linger without doing something practical like pouring coffee or correcting a servant's hem you sit. You let the sun find you. Mainstream fact. Incoming. The Victorian breakfast room was a status symbol, carefully arranged with masculine, authority leather-bound chairs, dark-stained oak, silver toast racks. Women were expected to oversee the service, but rarely to linger or lead conversations unless formally invited. So, of course, you claim the head seat just for 5 minutes. You let your gaze drift around the room, the gilt-framed hunting prints. Men with dogs always chasing. It's the mahogany sideboard with its intimidating decanter set. The clunky clock that ticks louder here than anywhere else in the house. You sip. It's good, hot alive. And suddenly, you think of the other women. Not just your mother or grandmother, but the women, the ones behind the walls. The ones whose names never made it into the family albums or onto plaques outside the church. Fringe detail. For your morning tea, there's growing evidence that some Victorian women intentionally sabotaged their home systems, drafting servants' instructions incorrectly, mismanaging household funds, feigning illness to exert tiny forms of control in otherwise airless lives. Historians call this passive domestic resistance. They prefer silent rebellion. Historians still argue whether these acts were conscious or simply expressions of frustration without language. But as you sit here sipping tea from a chipped Wedgwood cup, you think, of course it was deliberate. Even silence has intent. You rise. You don't put the chair back. You leave it slightly askew, an invisible marker that someone sat there who wasn't meant to. Maybe no one will notice. Maybe that's the point. Later that morning, the house starts to rustle back to life. Boots. On the stairs, the ring of silver spoons and porcelain bowls. Voices male, mostly testing the air for authority. You listen from behind the half-closed drawing room door. Her embroidery slipped again, someone says. We can't let her oversee the charity event after that fiasco. Maybe she's getting forgetful. You smile. The gossip is a fog that never quite lifts. But today, you aren't letting it settle into your lungs. Instead, you retrieve a piece of paper. Heavy parchment. Blank. There's something dangerous about blankness. And you begin to write not a letter, not a menu, not an apology, but a list, not of chores. A list of places in the house you've never entered alone. The wine cellar, the attic with the locked trunk, the second study your husband's, the servants. Quarters, the iron balcony outside the library. Each name pulses like a secret. You tap your pen against your lip and imagine each place like a new country awaiting. Your flag? They told you the house was a kingdom, but they never said whose. The attic calls first. You climb the narrow steps slowly. Teacup still in hand, trailing the steam like a scented ribbon. The attic door groans like an old dog. Dust dances in the beams of light like tiny ghosts, and the air smells of mothballs and history. There's the trunk. Locked, of course. Embossed with someone's initials MH, maybe a maiden aunt or forgotten cousin. You trace the curve of the metalwork. Wonder if the key still lives in a drawer somewhere, or if it's lost forever, buried in a tea tin or tucked behind a floorboard. Kneel beside it. And in that moment, you realize something else. You don't need the key, you need the knowing.
Out of being here.
The choice to kneel beside a forbidden object not because someone asked you to, but because you wanted to. Even locked trunks speak. The floor creaks behind you. You don't turn. Let them find you here. Let them ask why. You sip the last of your tea, and it's gone cold, but you drink it anyway. You stand, dust off your hands. You descend the stairs like a queen who's already buried the crown in the garden. You'll unlock that trunk. One day, or maybe you'll set it on fire. Depends. On the mood. You wake the next day to rain, not a drizzle, not polite, misty English weather. It's but a thunderous, sheets of water down the glass sort of rain that makes you feel like the house might eventually float away in murd, aimless, ready to sail into some other life entirely. You lie there listening, each droplet like a tiny footfall on the rooftop.
Ow!
The storm is perfect. It's the kind of weather that makes people whisper indoors, that gives you a legitimate reason not to go anywhere, not to entertain, not to be watched. You light a lamp. Even though it's barely past dawn and the yellow glow flickers across your dressing table, for a moment you think about doing your hair properly, lacing yourself into the blue and gray walking dress with the high collar and the mother-of-pearl buttons instead. You leave your hair undone. Let it fall past your shoulders. You wear only a petticoat, a shawl, and stockings. Scandalous by Victorian standards, but deliciously warm, and invisible to everyone else in the house. They don't see you like this. They see the finished product. The goose, not the plucking. Mainstream fact for this stormy interlude: Victorian women's daily dress required layer chemise. Drawers, corset cover, crinoline or bustle, multiple petticoats, and finally the gown itself. Dressing often took up to an hour and required assistance. Modesty was less about comfort and more about architectural precision. But here you are. Damp curls, loose shawl, stocking feet, just a woman, not a performance. You head to the library. It's the coldest room in the house, which is ironic, given how full it is of ideas. The fire's out, as usual. Someone keeps forgetting to lay it, or maybe they just don't bother because no one expects you to use it. Today you do. You light it yourself. Strike the match like it's a weapon. The books watch you.
Oh.
Lined up, silent judges in cracked leather bindings. You've read many of them, though not aloud, not publicly. It wouldn't be proper. Your favorite? A travelogue from a woman who dared to canoe up the Amazon in 1873. She wore trousers and carried a pistol in her boot. Unsuitable for lending, the cover reads. You love her instantly. You imagine what she'd do if she were here. Steal a horse or a footman? Maybe both. Instead, you take down another book. Something heavier. A treatise on architecture. Victorian domestic ideals, man as builder, woman as ornament. You laugh. It's an ugly little laugh. The kind that feels good in your ribs. Fringe fact incoming. Some Victorian feminist writers privately annotated domestic manuals with snide commentary ornament. A foot, and build your own damn conservatory before passing the books among one another in salon circles. These marginalia survive in a few archived copies. You wish your copy had one of those. You could use the company. The fire crackles behind you. You settle in one of the stiff velvet chairs, legs tucked under, tea precariously balanced on an armrest. The sound of the storm makes everything feel suspended, as if you're the only soul left moving, and that's when you make your list. Not the forbidden rooms. You've done that. Not your enemies. It's a different sort of game. This list is for allies. It's unlikely ones. The footman who always knocks twice before entering. The gardener who speaks to you like a real person. When no one's around, the housekeepers. Daughter who once taught you to play jacks and didn't care that you tore your gloves. Even the old cook who calls you my duck and tucks scraps of cake into your apron when you pretend to be helping tiny rebellions. Quiet loyalties. Women find ways. Historians still argue whether Victorian households operated more like prisons or plays, but either way, there were scripts, and people who forgot their lines were punished, or disappeared into marriages or clinics, or the guest bedroom permanently. You fold the list. Tuck it inside the book with the Amazon canoeist. One day, someone will find it. Maybe. But for now, you know who your quiet army is. The rain pounds harder. You let your eyes drift to the tall French doors. The ones that open onto the garden terrace. Normally locked when it storms. But today, someone left the key. You go to it. Turn it slowly. It opens with a sigh. The garden is a mess, leaves clinging to trellises, puddles swallowing flower beds. Everything is glossy and shaking and alive. And you, barefoot now, step outside. The cold bites instantly. Water up to your ankles, mud on your hem. Somewhere someone will shriek when they see what you've done. Let them. You walk to the rose arbor. It's broken in places. The last bloom is clinging to the edge like a secret. You pluck it. Thorns tear your palm. You don't care. You press it between your fingers. The color seeps into your skin, and the petals collapse softly like a sigh. You've been holding in for years. You walk back in soaked. A rose tucked behind your ear, and the butler sees you. His eyes widen. You don't explain? You don't have to, because maybe today he'll think twice about what women do on rainy days. Maybe he'll remember that his mother used to sing outside when it stormed. Maybe he'll never say a word. The house tries to hush again as you pass, but you're dripping footprints across the polished floor. And this time, you don't clean them up. You awaken to silence, not the comforting hush of a quiet house, but the sort that feels too deliberate, like someone has removed all the noise. The way a stagehand clears a set before a dramatic reveal, and indeed today is your debut, not on a stage. Worse, in the drawing room. There's a tea this afternoon, the kind with starched napkins, weak lemon slices, and guests who sniff between sips like they're hunting for scandal in the air. Ladies from the neighboring estate are coming. So is the vicar's wife, and horrifyingly a suitor. The one with the damp handshake. You dress accordingly. Powder blue silk, cinched to near breathlessness. Your corsets busk, biting just above your hip.
Oh.
You wear the topaz brooch your mother's, though. Hate the way it gleams, like a reward you never asked to earn. Mainstream fact, drawing rooms. In Victorian houses weren't just parlors, they were theaters of femininity. Women were expected to perform refinement, grace, and sociability. Sitting correctly, speaking in low tones, never crossing ankles unless hidden by fabric, it was an unspoken language of submission. You rehearse your lines? Yes. My mother's well. No. We haven't had much rain. How lovely that. You know Lord Ditherstone's cousin's dog. The drawing room smells of rosewater and furniture polish. Chairs are set like traps. China clinks in anticipation. You sit, you smile, you wait when they arrive. You fold into your old gracious light, obedient. You nod at the suitor like you haven't heard the gossip about his gambling debts and questionable interests in spiritualism. You pretend not to notice when the vicar's wife compliments your sturdy bone structure. Victorian code for you'll birth many children. Your tea goes cold. At one point, you drop your spoon, minor calamity. But when you stoop to retrieve it, something curious happens. You hear a creak behind the wall. Not in the wall. Behind it, you straighten. Smile, nod at a joke about cucumber. Sandwiches. Then you excuse yourself. You don't go upstairs. You don't go to the garden. You go to the hallway behind the library, where you felt the chill that one rainy afternoon. It's time you listen carefully. There it is again, a faint shifting. You press on the wall, nothing. Then again, tiny, give. Just enough your fingers find the seam, a hairline crack in the wallpaper. And now, dear listener, a secret, fringe tidbit. Some Victorian houses, especially large, ones with reputations to protect contained panic rooms or servant bypass, passages hidden within walls. These weren't just escape routes, but also spaces for surveillance, where servants could listen unseen, or where rebellious daughters were cooled down. You push harder. The panel clicks, swings, and behind it a narrow corridor. Dusty, dark, but real. You step inside. It's cramped. A grown man would struggle, but you slip in easily. The walls are wooden, unfinished. A single gas sconce, barely lit, casts flickering shadows ahead. You walk slowly. The passage runs along the edge of the house. You pass behind the dining room. The smoking room, the music room. You can hear muffled conversations, some aunt discussing embroidery, someone chuckling about the suffragists' latest antics. You walk farther than you thought possible, and then you find it. A tiny hidden room. No windows. A single chair. A shelf of books, mostly Bibles, but also some treatises on female hysteria, and even one worn volume of Mary Wollstonecraft. There's a bed. Not a soft one. A scratched mirror, and a hair ribbon still looped around the bedpost. You don't breathe. Historians still argue whether these hidden rooms were truly for safety or simply tools of controlled disciplinary cells wrapped in mahogany paneling. Some were labeled retreats, others reform chambers. You sit in the chair, feel the pulse of silence return. You wonder who else sat here. A maid accused of impropriety, a daughter who said too much at supper, a wife who didn't smile enough. You look in the mirror, Your reflection doesn't flinch. You take the ribbon and you walk out. Back through the corridor, back into the hallway, and just before you reach the drawing room again, you stop. You lean against the wall, rest your head against the cool plaster. Then deliberately you laugh, because now you know something they don't. There's a hidden artery in this house, eh? Secret spine that runs behind the organs of drawing room and dining table and reception hall, and you found it. Not the suitor, not the housekeeper, not even the architect. Likely long dead and praised in too many footnotes, you walk back into the tea. Sit down. Smile, but the ribbon's in your sleeve now, and if they ever try to send you to your room, again lock you away, or cool your nerves, you'll smile and nod, obey. ... Then vanish into the walls, and reappear when they least expect it. You wake to something strange. Not silence this time. Sound not the familiar ticking of the hall, clock, or the ghost of footsteps from upstairs. No, this is something deeper, subterranean, a vibration running up through the soles of your feet. As you swing them out of bed, a rumble, a hum. It's the house again. Breathing, or groaning, or warning. And today, it all ends. You dress without summoning the maid. You've learned to lace yourself now. The corset doesn't strangle as it once did. It's still a cage, sure, but a cage you've learned to pick the lock of. There's a storm in the distance. You can smell it before you see a toe zone, heavy leaves, that coppery tinge in the air. Like the sky's grinding its teeth, the weather never did take orders from the drawing room. You descend the stairs slowly, fingertips grazing the banister. Each polished spindle, each oil painting past, feels like a final bow to a cast you've grown to know intimately. The mother who flutters, the father who dictates, the servants who vanish before they breathe too loudly.
House itself, though.
Real villain looming in the background, mainstream fact. By the late 19th century, domestic manuals for ladies of the house advised strict control over decor, sound, and the movement of servants. Homes became curated performance zones for men to unwind and women to be admired. Don't speak too much in the hallway, was actual advice. But today, no script. You push open the study door. He's there, your father. Of course he is. Posed behind that desk like a gargoyle carved from mahogany and duty. He looks up and something flickers in his eyes. He knows. You place the ribbon on the blotter. He blinks. He knows you don't speak. You don't have to, because the thing about power is, once you recognize its architecture, you stop being impressed by the wallpaper. Fringe tidbit. Some Victorian feminists quietly, dangerously believed that escape from the home was the first step toward salvation. They built secret correspondences, networks, sometimes even false identities. There were documented cases of women smuggling themselves out of country estates hidden in laundry carts or beneath stagecoaches. You've never looked at a laundry cart the same way since. The rain starts. First just a whisper, then a roar. You turn from the study and walk back through the hall, down into the servants' corridor. That hidden passage you found it has a twin. You knew there must be an S night, while the others drank Madeira and discussed the cost of port. You found it. You duck through the narrow archway, lift the iron latch, and disappear once more. Behind you, thunder cracks, the house shudders. Indignant, you smile. Historians still argue whether Victorian homes were built to protect women or imprison them. Were the thick drapes and silent corridors meant for privacy or control? Was the locked pantry a symbol of domestic provision or deprivation? You know now, because the house has shown you. It hid the others. It made you watch. But it also miscalculated. You saw, you walked the spine again. Past the old servants' quarters, where the walls are still etched with a cook's tally marks. Past the dusty linen closet where someone once scratched a note in the wood. I won't marry him. You reach the exit. It's barely a door, more of a warped board. But it swings open to a world washed clean with rain. And they're soaked in... Grinning and breathless is Clara. Remember her? Alesta with the calloused hands, the kitchen girl with the eyes too bright for the scullery.
Wait, no.
She ran days ago. Left only her apron and a half-burnt letter to the women's franchise. League, you didn't think she'd wait, but here she is. She takes your hand, and you run. The fields blur past, wet and golden, as the storm breaks above you. Every step is thunder. Every breath a refusal. Behind you, the house stares. It will tell stories, recreate you as a ghost, a warning. They'll say, poor dear, lost her mind, or eloped with a chimney sweep, or vanished, must have gone to London. You will know you escaped, because you learned the blueprint. The real one, not just floor plans, power plans, where the doors really are, where the walls are. Hollow where the voices echo, and most importantly, where the cracks let the light in. And now, finally, the storm fades. The rain softens to mist, like the house is exhaling its last breath. Somewhere in the distance, a cuckoo calls faint, uncertain, echoing through trees that no longer belong to a manor, but to the world again. You and Clara walk slower now. Your shoes are ruined. Mud clings to your hems, and your hair smells of smoke and wind and something feral freedom, maybe. Behind you, the house grows small. It's not monstrous anymore. It's bricks and glass, and the memories it failed to bury. There's no grand carriage waiting, no hero's fanfare. It's only a narrow path and a sky that's finally clear. And that's enough. You don't need every answer right now. You don't even need to know where you're going, only that it isn't back. Because tonight, you've done more than escape for walls. You've cracked open the myth of safety. You've traced the outlines of invisible cages and found there hinges. You've whispered back at a structure built to silence you, and it listened. So now close your eyes. Feel the weight lift from your shoulders inch by inch. The corset is gone. The eyes behind curtains are gone. The rules, the rituals, the locked doors, they all melt away into soft dark. What's left is breath. Yours. Steady now. Let your pulse slow with the wind. Let sleep tug gently at your wrists. You've outrun the house. You've rewritten the story. And tomorrow you begin again.